We're live. Okay, hello everybody uh, who showed up. We are going to be doing a little bit of a breakdown today of Baltic Pantheon family tree chart that we just worked on past week at Studio Pandemonia. Then we'll kind of talk for an hour about it. We'll go through this chart here, we'll show it off, and I'll have a bit of information. And we've also got a guidebook right here in the middle that I'm able to look at and see and show off that both me and Calley worked on. So we do this every Sunday, either me or both me and Calley here on Sundays, kind of doing a research session or showing off some work, doing some casual work. Last Sunday we did a little bit of our work on our fantasy world building type stuff. This week, we actually postponed last week the Baltic Pantheon because there were a few things that still needed to be finished in the guidebook and here with the chart itself. But all of our charts are available in two places. One is Gumroad, which is a really new, nice platform. It's kind of like a Patreon, but we think it's way better because it has all kinds of content. It has downloadable content. There's memberships. You can just tip whatever you want, or there's like classes and stuff that we could set up and all things like that. It's very cool. So we have a link of that in the description. Our other place you can get it, if it's more comfortable, is Etsy. We have all of our Pantheon family trees on there from various cultures. The guidebooks cannot be on Etsy though, so if you want a guidebook that comes with them, that will be on our Gumroad. Is that everything I really need to say about that part of the process?
The guidebooks are available on Etsy. They're just kind of trimmed down to 20 megabytes. They have annoying size restrictions. But also, if you were looking to get like everything that we've done so far, if you go to the Gumroad, there's actually a bundle price that's kind of a pay what you want, where it's got like a minimum, and then you can tip more if you can, but it's not like required. So that's going to be the best bang for your buck. Is definitely the bundle on Gumroad there. We can't really do that on Etsy because their bundle, I think, caps off at like 3 items or something dumb. But there's lots of other great, super fun, cool stuff on Etsy if you are spring shopping. And we're supposed to say that if you're looking for birthday presents, evidently that's the best place. Etsy is the best place you could ever buy a birthday present. I guess they want you to know. So if you've got birthday stuff coming up, we actually did work on some really cool new astrology items. So if you're shopping for a person here in the coming Aries season, we've got some brand new items that are a little more thematic in that way we hadn't before, which is bizarre for us, right? Because like that's most of what we do. So we're hopefully caught up now on some cool offerings of those. I think that's it for this week's announcements.
Yeah.
We're going to try and be more structured this time. Like you said, we're going to do an hour of pure presentation and then Q&A. So we have been trying to get the study materials ready the night beforehand, at least, if not earlier, so that you can get your questions together. But it was a little late last night, me posting stuff. So if you want it, go get it now and see if you can skim through and get a couple questions together. But hopefully our presentation will offer, enough to go on.
Some help and some fun.
So, basic, well, to introduce, I guess, just first off, we'll have a link for this in the description as well, but our main source was a book that Josh picked up at Convocation that is The Dance of the Sun Goddess, Pagan Folkways of the Baltic Coast. And this was a really fun book to pick up because I know absolutely nothing about it. I really don't know much about the Baltic Pantheon, so it was kind of fun to pick one that was so new to me.
And I knew a bit about everything just because of the manner in which I do my research. And I actually, through a lot of my research, I found Lithuanian mythology to be very interesting. And I have even an article right here. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but Romuva, for instance, is a modern neo-pagan religion of Lithuanian pantheon. There's also another one called Dievturība for the Latvians. But this is actually one of the most preserved, well-preserved pagan polytheistic movements and pantheons in Europe, because they were never fully and completely Christianized. They're one of the last holdouts for paganism, and a lot of people were actively practicing and following the songs, which had many stories of the Dinas, right, which are the names of the songs that preserve a lot of the stories and the myths. So they didn't necessarily write everything down. It was actually oral tradition still. And so those were kind of still preserved in the tradition, and they were able to pick up now in the modern era with paganism. So just
Do
thought
you
I'd
have a
throw that
map
in there.
about that, or like, can you list off like what region this is really talking about?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. That's me. I figured on Wikipedia they probably have it pretty okay. This is not the best. So the Baltic Sea is what the Baltic is referred to as, but the Baltic in general is right here. That's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Prussia. That's the little piece of Russia right here, and Kaliningrad and stuff. I know that's not the best map ever. Maybe there's a few more. These are just kind of random maps, really. On Wikipedia. Okay, there. It's not necessarily better, but it still shows this region right here. Estonian is actually more related to Finnish mythology, so that would be in a different one. But Latvian, Lithuanian are the two most preserved. Prussian, as you can tell, doesn't exist anymore. They were kind of wiped out by and assimilated by the Teutonic Knights, who were a bunch of crazy Christian crusaders who tried to kill off and convert all these Baltic pagans to Christianity. And they became the basis of the Prussian state, actually, that evolved into Germany, which is a very interesting, crazy story. But they were pretty nuts, and they did some bad things. There's quite a few ethnicities that were wiped out by them when they came into this region. So that's a little bit of a backstory there. Another thing to generally say is the Baltic mythology and the Baltic languages, like Lithuanian, are thought to be the most closely connected, or have, it's, for instance, very closely connected to Vedic Sanskrit, right, which is a very interesting connection. And there's a lot of deities and motifs actually resonate with that. And that goes back to a general hypothesis that they are one of the first offshoots of the Indo-Europeans out of the steppe, and they settled in this forest region. Or otherwise, another hypothesis is that the steppe people that became Indo-Europeans kind of split off from people who lived in this forest environment here, and so they had a certain relationship. But the Balts stayed in this region, whereas the Indo-Europeans went to the steppe and then spread everywhere else. So those are a few very somewhat simplified ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, so fair warning to everyone, this language group is probably one of my weakest, so just count on everything being pronounced wrong by me, and you can yell at me in the comments, but I literally have no idea. I probably should have prepared a little bit more, at least about the pronunciation, but maybe it'll provide better entertainment value if I don't, so it's probably fine. So the structure that we kind of came up with in looking to build this guide, similarly to the Druid guide, where we wanted to really focus on like the practice and the embodiment stuff and like what people actually do. We have 3 sections. It just ended up being 3 again. They kind of roughly correlated, of course. In the Druid one, we had that lack of kind of the airy element, but they seemed to kind of go in this like land, sea, sky, or like heaven, earth, underground, something like that in these sets of 3. So for the Baltic, we have this trinity of the Dangus. Maybe it's Dongus, but we've been saying Dangus, which is the sky or the celestial realm. The Zeme, which is the land, and Lemptis, which is fate. So this is kind of the framework that we built the guide around and grouped the deities around. So sky is actually kind of the airy element stuff as well as the fiery element stuff, because a lot of that like yang, creative force, fiery, forgy kind of stuff ends up being associated with the sky. Land is the usual kind of like foresty and mountainy and wealth and things like that, farming, all that kind of stuff under land. And then Lentus was a little bit more abstract and interesting, but that's where a lot of the underworldly kind of stuff ended up, and sort of the more wet, watery oriented stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
Although it is kind of interspersed throughout, because they have a lot with storms, so storms are kind of a consistent motif throughout all of these sections that kind of ties them all together. The Baltic Pantheon has a lot in common with other pagan traditions, of course, where there's a lot of lighting things on fire. That's pretty consistent with those Vedic roots that Josh was talking about. There's just a lot of ritual fire offering kind of things. They are very sun-oriented also, so like seasonal stuff is pretty loud. And one of the embodiment practices in the way that's kind of unique is they're really musical, and I found that to be pretty interesting. So there's these dinos that are folk songs, and similar to like the Orphic tradition, this use of music as the vehicle to pass down the oral tradition, and kind of combine both the historical, what actually happened, just kind of going through the chronological series of events, and then also mixing in the lore, and the actual cosmology stuff. So that's what those are.
Mm-hmm.
And they also do some sort of like, I didn't get to find a whole lot of it in this book, but evidently there's kind of like rain dancing or like really weather invoking specific kind of rituals that they do.
Mm-hmm. And that's common also in Slavic. Actually, another side comment here is Slavic languages and Slavic peoples are also descended from the same root as the Baltic people. And in academia, we generally refer to the entire group as Balto-Slavic. The Slavs are the one that kind of split off, went south, and settled this sort of Poland-Ukraine area down there on this map. And ultimately, they found themselves in the steppe area and such. So, a note about the Vedic and about the reconstructed neo-paganism is Slavic and Baltic both. Actually, a lot of the reconstructionist neo-pagan movements, they look to Vedic Hindu traditions often, and they use those ideas and motifs and philosophies, since they're more hashed out and there's more of it preserved, to kind of reconstruct some of the practices and the ideas and the mythology and relationships of Baltic and Slavic. So that's another little side note there, I guess, before we continue. The cat's going to be a little annoying. Hey, Taters, come here. Come. Just come here. Okay, so I would like to look at these three deities here a little bit, and that'll be starting here on the chart. So when I make these charts, it's really always interesting what structure ends up happening, because I don't know. A lot of these pantheons, they don't have any family trees made for them. We got our major ones, Greek and Egyptian and whatnot, that people make ad nauseum. I haven't even made a Greek one yet because it's probably going to be my next one I make. Just I feel like I should have it by now. But I always wanted to do the more obscure and the unknown. I've done a few that are actually quite obscure at this point, and I enjoy doing it. And so really seeing it for the first time all together like this, I feel really it helps. It helps me make sense of the research I'm doing and put it in context. And often I construct it in a way that is indicative of the kind of thoughts and the areas and the zones and lineages that represent the ideas of the pantheon in general. So we have the primordial deities up top, and I'm going to start by talking about, we have here Svigsdanka and Bangputis, and another name for Svigsdanka, actually it's more popular in the Latvian, is Bangumate. If there's a mate at the end, that's a Latvian goddess. That's just how they name their goddesses. Bangputis also has a few other names and forms. Vejopatis is one of them in Lithuanian, and that means wind father. So that's a little related also, by the way, to the Vedic Vayu and Vayuvata, the wind father. There's a very deep kind of connection between those two being very important in the pantheon. Svigsdanka is a little obscure, but in cross-referencing, Bangputis he's kind of a two-faced wind god, sea god, storm god. There are a few deities kind of like that, like Aegir in Norse, that are these combination of the sea and wind and storms. You kind of see this in a lot of old motifs in Poseidon as well with the Greeks, is that he represented all kinds of things and not just the sea. He originally was considered chthonic in some ways because the sea was thought to be under the earth, and that's where earthquakes were caused, and so he was, the god of the earthquakes. And there's a similar thing going on with Bangputis here, is that the sea and the storms were kind of one and the same, because a sea storm in the North Sea and in the Baltic is, it's all the same monster really that you're dealing with, right? So there's not this separation in him between sky and sea. It's all one chaotic entity. He himself is he's kind of mean and austere, as they say. I think one of the deities in here, I believe it is Oseklis down here, he actually went swimming. He went swimming in the Baltic Sea, and Bangputis was just like, get the hell out of here, and he started whipping up sea storms and tried to kill him. So that's a little example of his mentality. So he's definitely very old, very kind of natural, a little chaotic. A lot of the practices, not to talk for you, Calley, but a lot of the practices with seafaring in the Baltic have to do with making sure he has been satisfied, that you're leaving a little bit of fish for him, you're leaving on the shoreline all kinds of offerings for him, not to piss him off. Another interesting kind of dynamic there is his partner, Bangumate, which then relates to wind mother. It's wind mother, just like Bangpatis. She has certain obscure records I found that she actually might have created the stars or the night sky, and it's very interesting to me because it kind of reminds me, I mentioned Aegir and Lear. Actually, Aegir is considered to be like Lear. Lear is the Welsh sea god. His partner is I'm thinking which one specifically. Sorry, this is my tangential thinking method. Here he is. Okay, Aegir's partner is Ran, and Ran is associated with a net because the net is what she uses to drag seafarers down onto the bottom of the sea, right? And I just wanted to bring that up. I don't know where else I would get a chance to bring that connection up, but it's very interesting how many things aligned, and how if she's weaved the stars, then maybe she weaved the net, and there's an oceanic as well as a cosmic connection. And so one thing I was almost thinking is that, and I wrote it in here as well, is that perhaps she represents a slightly more benevolent force than her husband, and she put the stars in the sky in order to help the seafarers navigate the seas. And I thought that was kind of an interesting connection. There's not like an explicit statement anywhere of that, but it's very interesting when you put all the practices together. So one way in which that was like the offerings would be made would be towards him and her. I would say the best way you could probably get through to him is through her, right? Because she's a little more willing to listen. Do you have anything to say about this, Calley? I've been going on for a while.
No, that's kind of a cool connection. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's interesting. Like, he definitely is like kind of that Poseidon flavor of petty, a little bit of wrathful. And so it's interesting that in this pantheon, the four winds actually are their children. So, like Poseidon in some kind of indirect ways commands the winds or has a relationship with them, but he's not their father. So it's kind of interesting that Bangputis is actually the father, and they do his bidding, and they kind of each have their personalities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and getting into that about these wind gods, I have very little to say about them because there's not much said about them in general, but I just like to allude to that kind of that motif here. The motif of the four winds and the four directions is something that's very common throughout the world. You even see it with the Mayans. You see it everywhere. So north, south, east, and west. These are the sons of Bangumate and Bangputis. So here are all four of them here. There's Ciaris of the north wind, Pietis of the south wind. Pietis might relate to the Greek deity Pyrois, has the same root of pyro, fire, and this fire god also associated with Mars. A lot of fire gods are associated with the south, in other places maybe with the west. There's often there's a fiery or a hot wind god of the four winds. It's quite common. And then there's a cold northern one almost every time, unless you're in the southern hemisphere, in which it might be a little different. I actually don't know if I've seen too many southern hemisphere wind gods, but I'll have to look a little bit more into that. Then we have Ritis, the east wind, and if you see here, there are two east winds. There's Auseklis, who's considered an east wind, or at least mostly associated with the evening star of Venus, and Ritis is not necessarily associated with the evening star, but is with the east. That's another correlation we see in a lot of mythology, is that east is related to Venus and the morning star, the dawn star. And the dawn, that's where Venus is. And often west is associated with the evening star, with Venus during dusk. So that would be Vacaris over here on the left, the west wind. And the west wind often aligns with death motifs because it's the evening, it's the end of the day, it's the end of life. It's in many mythologies from Egyptian throughout the rest of the world, your soul is kind of born out of the underworld in the east, and there's all these connotations with Eastern birth goddesses and sky goddesses and dawn goddesses and love goddesses, you know, Aurora and Eos and Venus and such. And then in the evening there are these death, chthonic, Morgana, Vacarine-like deities. I have down here Vacarine right next to Osrine. Just want to mention that. We'll get to that, but Osrine is the dawn goddess, a very important dawn goddess of Baltic, and Vacarine is her kind of counterpart. It's ambiguous whether or not they're the same, but they're just different aspects of morning and an evening aspect. But that Vacarine linguistics, I suspect Vacaris Vacarine relates to the motif of Victoria, and that's like the evening victory goddess. You know, the Valkyries, they're kind of like vultures that carry the dead souls over the horizon into the underworld at night. In the evening, there's a few different things that align that way. So yeah, I think that's it for the winds. And now, could you tell everybody a little bit about how winds factor in, directions and winds factor into like actual pagan ritual and practice?
I actually couldn't really figure that out from the book, whether they do in fact call corners in a similar way, but obviously the elemental layout is similar to contemporary Wiccan practice, where you have, you know, the cold earth in the north, the fire in the south, which is hot, the western water, and the eastern air. So that all maps. As far as like, do they actually call corners in that way? I couldn't really figure it out, honestly, from the reference book or anything like that. A lot of it had to do with a lot of like more folky traditions, rather than maybe as formalized liturgical. And I could be totally wrong. I just couldn't find it. But compared to like the druidic practice we talked about last time, it seemed a lot less rigid and a lot more, you know, holiday oriented. And a big thing that's different I guess, between the Druids. And I was reminded of this the other day, of course, because I got my usual text from my father, happy equinox. He still, bless his heart, has not gotten the memo. Druids typically, the 4 high days, which are, we talked about last time, is like Imbolc, Beltane, Samhain. Not the equinoxes and solstices. That's very different in Baltic. They're very solar oriented. So the equinoxes and solstices were much more important and ritualized. In this guide, we actually didn't go into as much detail about like the holidays and what they are like, because this book does such a fabulous job of actually breaking it down and having all of the dinos and the actual scripts and stuff. So if you are interested in actually practicing, there's just really nothing that we could do better than kind of this book already does. So we highly suggest, and we've got our link in there. We do earn a commission from our library reading list. We're going to do a much better job in the future of making sure that we thoroughly document and list out all of our references, all of our citations, and have kind of these reading lists. We use Goodreads a lot, but not enough. And perhaps we'll come up with a better system of categorizing these things, so there's kind of like a shared pandemonic library of references that we think check out and are good and value. So this one's definitely on there.
I'm skipping ahead here a little bit into, it's at the bottom of the section here. Calavelis and Gabia. I just want to make a little short note on this because these are a little obscure deities. Calavelis is, the typical smithing god, creator god. Gabia is the quintessential fire mother. And so the smithing god obviously is everywhere, everywhere where smithing happened. And Gabia, or the fire mother, is all over the northern hemisphere in particular, because it's very important to have fire when it's very cold where you live. So it's a tradition that probably goes back very, very far. Now, the partnership between these two deities is something that actually I take credit for. I'm sorry, I'm putting forth a little bit of my own read here. I think the connection that I'm getting between the fire and the smith is quite evident. The hearth and the forge is often a dynamic and a partnership in many mythologies. But in particular with, if we'll look up right here in my database, in Slavic, her name is Mater Gabia, which just means, again, fire mother. So Slavic and Lithuanian and Baltic, they all have this same fire mother. It's the same goddess, which then, again, still implies she's very old and very important and in that whole dynamic. There is a cognate with Gobanin or Goibnu, which is the Celtic smithing god, with that same fire base of linguistics. So through that connection, I was like, okay, well, they're counterparts maybe in a way, the smith and the fire, in terms of Indo-European, in terms of Celtic and Baltic and Slavic and all these northern and Western European things. And so I'd like to talk about Calavelis just a little bit. Another one, his name is Taliavelis, but he's got a lot in common with a very specific motif of the smithing god and the creator god within northern Eurasia. In particular, with the Finno-Ugric groups and mythologies, there's a smithing god called Ilmari or Ilmarinen, and he's credited with creating the sky. There's a general motif in Finno-Ugric. And Finno-Ugric, again, looking at this map, as I said, Finland, Ugric is the Ural Mountains off the screen over here, but this entire region here is right next to the Baltic region here. And so they most certainly influenced each other in various ways. Okay. So Ilmari is said to have crafted the sky, the firmament, and in their mythology they see the sky as a mountain. It's called the Sky Mountain. This is another term in Latvian for the world tree, the dawn tree. It's considered to be either a tree or a sky mountain. So there's a general motif of, yeah, the sky is held up by a big tree, or the sky is a great mountain, and it's made of metal. It's made of stone, and that it was crafted, and holes and fires are put upon it that resemble the stars and planets and things. So that's exactly what Telliabellus is reported to have done. He created, in particular, there's a little motif in there that he created the sun and then threw it up into the sky, that he crafted it and threw it up into the sky. And in the context of, obviously in the context of Baltic Pantheon, we haven't gotten to it yet, but Sole, I have her as the main goddess on the picture of this video because she is quite simply the most important deity in Baltic. She's the sun goddess, the sun mother. And a lot of people focus on her because there's this idea in the neo-pagan community that the sun is a male, and there's kind of this gendering that often goes on, these assumptions, and the moon is female, the sun is male. This is something that he talks about in the book a little bit too, but it's obviously a misconception that a deity has to be one or the other. Quite often they are both, and it depends on the context. And, you know, I just thought I'd want to throw that in there. But it's obviously very important if Telliabellus is said to have created the sun in one context, and then in another context, Sole is this very important mother goddess, then I put two and two together, and that with the fire mother, I imagine that perhaps the fire mother provided the fire, and he crafted the sun and threw it up in the sky, therefore perhaps Gabia and Telliabellus are mothers of Sole. So that's kind of what I put on here. Sometimes I make those kinds of decisions despite not having complete evidence that that's how it's said to be in many sources, because if they were up there, it would be implied they're important, but they would be disconnected from everything else. And I like to find connections and to create stories as much as I can. So if things kind of align and fit in that case and have other mythologies that do the similar thing, I go down that and I accept that route. So yeah, with that, I think let's go back to the sun goddess herself, Sole or Solia. And this is the same root as Sol or Sunna, the Germanic sun goddess, who's partnered with Menes or Menevellus, I think, or Menulus, I think. There's the sun, the moon god, and that's Mani in Norse as well. There's also Men and Many in Greek. There's quite a lot of contexts where this very specific men, moon root, the word we have for moon, I believe is taken from Anglo-Saxon version of Mani, the Germanic moon god. So very important. We have the sun and the moon right here, even our own English linguistics that is related directly to this old Baltic Indo-European dynamic. Also, the partnership between moon and sun is very common throughout the world. We see it in Eurasia, we see it in, I think, parts of China, we see it in the Americas. So yeah. Thought I'd want to bring that up. And the two of them are the parents of the 5, and I see there's 6 here, but it's 5 stars, moving stars, planets, the stellar daughters. Each one of them is daughters of Sole, and each one of them corresponds to a different planet. There's Mercury, Venus. Again, I told you Vaccarine and Osirine are they're both Venus, and so maybe they're two aspects of the same goddess. Zezre is Mars, and then Jupiter is Indraja, Silesia is Saturn. It's interesting to note Indraja, very linguistically related to Indra. Whether or not that was a reconstructed import or an authentic old tradition, I'm not entirely certain of. There's some speculation that someone might have actually taken the Vedic and kind of filled in the gaps there. Maybe there wasn't a name for her per se. But nonetheless, Indraja is, I think, related to a lot of thundery, stormy, rainy motifs, which, as Calley mentioned, there's a few goddesses that actually have a pretty important part to play in that theme.
There's this special resting place that's speculated about. Where does the sun go, when it sets? And so it's thought of here as the dawn tree itself is where she goes. accompanied by her daughters, which are the two aspects of Venus that you mentioned, Mercury and Vaccarine, as far as the evening and morning Venus. And so those are, they also attend her and help her with this task, which is similar to Apollo, of course, driving the chariot. Um, but it is also thought that she's just got this like silver castle on an island, and it's kind of like veiled in mystery. And so it's kind of this like Baltic koan in a way of like, where does the sun go when it sleeps? Um, and so speculation about that and people trying to like quest and find her make up kind of an interesting part of the mythos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's So in general, the way it's talked about is in the morning, in the far east, she wakes up and Osrine gets her up, the Venus morning star goddess, gets her up, and the Dia Videli, who I have right here, that's the divine twins. Didn't talk about them yet because then we'll talk about them over there. But they actually are personified either as horsemen or as horses, and they pull the chariot of Soleil across the sky. So ties them up and gets on her chariot with copper wheels. There's also this golden and copper coloring with Soleil. That's very important. And with Osrine guiding, and also Oseklis, the son of Osrine. He's basically Eros, but he's like kind of an older, more like Phosphorus of the old Pelasgian roots of Eros, or Cupid, which is more like Lucifer, the light bringer. He's Venus, and he guides the light basically of the chariot toward the far west, where the tree is, or the silver castle is. And so, yeah, they start out their day moving in that direction, kind of a big entourage all around her. And the other stars, some of them are also there. I think Vevora, whose Mercury is very important. She's the most important of them because she's the eldest and she's kind of the wise sage of them all. She advises Soleil the most. Because, of course, Mercury, alongside Venus is on the interior planets. It's closer to the sun than us, and therefore, when we see the sun across the sky, it's being surrounded by those two planets. And so that's why throughout all mythologies around the world, whenever they observed Venus and Mercury over the horizon for the small times that they could see them, when it was dark enough, just before dawn and just after sunset, they would note that these are very close messengers or helpers of the sun. So that's true in this case as well. Now, where are they guiding them? Calley mentioned the Silver Palace, and there's also an idea that the Dawn Tree, which is the name for the World Tree or the Sky Mountain, is on an island in the far west. But this special otherworld island is actually so kind of mystical that it's both in a sense it's the farthest west that you can go and also the farthest east that you can go. That at some point they meet up, and that's this magical realm. It's similar to the ideas of the Undying Lands in Tolkien. It's taken from the same kind of source. In Celtic, there's also an otherworld that's thought to be in the Atlantic Ocean toward the west. And the west in general, as long as Atlantis as well in Greek sources, is considered to be farthest west, idyllic paradise afterworld, where all the souls go when they die into the west, right? So I think there was another motif. We don't, not all the sources necessarily say what kind of tree the Dawn Tree is, the World Tree is for Baltic, but all the sources that do say what it is, they say it's a golden apple tree. So that's interesting to note. Because that carries with it kind of these ideas of immortality, potentially the ideas of this being a divine Eden-like realm. Either that came later after Christianization or was originally a thing local to that region. I don't think we fully know. Apples are actually native to Central Asia, I believe. So it is possible the Indo-Europeans actually brought apples to the Baltic, or already had apples up in Eurasia. So it's not too crazy to think that that was maybe an original motif there, and that maybe the apple tree motif spread from the Indo-Europeans elsewhere. So that's a little note about that. Anything else? Oh, I could talk about another story a little bit about Calley and Menes. They have kind of a tried relationship. At one point they get divorced because Menes does some menacing things, mean things to people, cheats on her several times. So they get divorced eventually. One of these love childs is Sechelus, the Dawn Star, the Eros that he has with Osrine. There's another term for Osrine, actually, it's Solis Mate, Mita, I mean, which is just means Soleil's daughter. And in those sources, some of the things that happen are different from the sources that refer to Venus as Osrine or any of the other names for her. So I originally thought they were different, but it turns out because some of the motifs align very similarly with being partnered with Menes, that I think that Sun's daughter is the most important daughter, or the second most important, or whatever, of Calley, which is Osrine. That's one thing to mention. There's also a myth about, I guess, Menes was punished for his infidelity. There's some stories that say he was chopped up with a knife, and that's part of why he goes through the phases of the moon to crescent moon throughout the month, and the moon cycles exist. There's a lot of motifs across the world of like, oh, why is the moon become crescent over the course of the month, and why is it full and then a crescent moon? Why are the moon phases a thing? And a lot of them do kind of involve the moon getting punished in some way, or being like, some of them are like he's starving, he's getting skinnier. Some of them are like he's being bitten out of by a big wolf or something. I think that might be one of the Norse interpretations, because they're supposed to be traced by two wolves. Make a little note about Evora, which is Mercury. It's one of my favorite deities I discovered, actually. I really like her. Of course, I'm a Gemini, so I like anything related to Mercury. So I always look for the motifs. But she's got this ribbon, rainbow ribbon, that she crafted, because a lot of these deities associated with the rain are also associated with weaving. So the rainbow is like her ribbon. And sometimes it was like stolen. Sometimes she's said to be partnered with Perkunas, who's the main thunder god in the Pantheon. I didn't make a connection here because they didn't have any children. But if you look over here towards Perkunas, the thunder god, there's Perkuna, who's a rain goddess. And she's kind of ambiguous. And she's mostly a term in Slavic and Baltic for the rain dance itself in that tradition. But has a few embodiments as the wife of Perkunas. And Perkunas, or Perun, is the Balto-Slavic thunder god, and really just the Indo-European thunder god. He's related as well to Jupiter, Jove, all these different thunder god deities. There's many ways in which Vevora might be the same as Perkuna, or is conflated with her in some way, and I find that interesting because, of course, rain and rainbow is all related. But there are some rainbow goddesses throughout the world that are kind of related to peace and harmony. And some of them are messenger goddesses, like Iris, who's basically the messenger of the Titans before Hermes takes over as a messenger of the Olympians. So yeah, I thought I'd throw those in there. If anyone wants to find some interesting research, they can probably follow her threads to wherever they want to go. With that, I think I've gotten a little bit into the Perkunas stuff. Thunder God, is he still up here, or is he in a different category? Yeah, he's up here. I don't have much more to say about him. I think most people who know anything about Indo-European understand who the Thunder God is, to be honest. But he he has an axe, not a hammer. That's a little differentiation from Thor, I guess. Um, a lot of what makes him interesting is how he is dynamic with a few of the other deities that I'll mention, I think. Is there anything else about the rain goddess motif you wanted to mention? Okay. So going to Divas a little bit, another deity I don't probably have to talk about too much because Divas is Dios, is the Sky Father in Indo-European. He's everywhere. He's the basis of the name for Zeus, but Zeus himself is more like Perkunas, the thunder god, not actually just a pure sky god. If anything in Greek is similar to Divas, it's Uranus, the god of the sky who's really far and away. Or Aether, who is said to be like an ancient deity that created the world, created the earth. He's the name that's kind of given to the Christian god by the Balts these days. And many of his motifs are very much related to that. I think Divas is actually probably one of my favorite sky fathers because he is said to descend to the earth in the form of like an old man or a vagabond or a peasant and kind of just work the land. And he would kind of go from house to house knocking on people's doors. And if they didn't give him hospitality or help him out like they should morally do, hospitality is a big idea and value and virtue in these regions. He would punish them by turning them into an animal and then taking away their property, basically. So he was a bit of a communist, and that's pretty fun about him. He's all about helping people and being a good person. So he's not the kind of sky god that necessarily just sits up there and does nothing. He doesn't intervene in big ways. He intervenes in small little ways, and that's why he's considered to be kind of the mythological and poetic basis of the law in Baltic and Lithuanian and other mythologies, because the law in that sense is like morality itself, right and wrong. So it's very interesting about him. I mentioned the Dieva Devi, that's the twin gods. They are the sons. They're one of the only deities that very explicitly is the son, or are sons of Devas. Perkunas, Menes, even Sole, all these other deities are kind of like here and there said to be children of his, because he's the sky father. He's just the father of everybody. Even Zemina is sometimes said to be. But I suspect that Zemina, in other forms, often is a partner. The Gaia to Uranus, the Earth Mother to the Sky Father, as being a partner. When it comes to Zemina, it's a totally different, I guess, category than where we're at. We talked about Perkune, Dievideli, Divas, and the planets. Very briskly, I mentioned Breska. I didn't put her on the chart because she doesn't have any kind of lineage. I could add her at some point, but she generally represents the witching hour, which is twilight. And she is thus associated with witchcraft and these kinds of things, dreams, stuff like that. I kind of think her almost as a kind of Bridget, but you can be a judge of that. So yeah, okay, that's all the celestial Dangus deities. The interesting thing about Dangus as a word I didn't mention earlier is that it's very much related or similar to Dingir, and which is Sumerian, and Tengri, which is Mongolian, Turkic. A lot of these words for the sky itself is this din, D, or Dangus. It's also funny because I just think of Dangus as like it's like an insulting term that's thrown around as in a humorous way. It's not like a very serious one. It's just kind of, I just like that word. I think it's funny. I say it all the time. All right, so now we're getting to Zeme.
So yeah, Zeme, so we're on to the next category, which is the earth-based deity. And as Josh said, Zemina kind of is like Gaia. She's the earth itself. And as far as like specific reverence, she's not necessarily like one of the story character kind of deities. She's kind of like the conceptual earth. So kind of every earth offering is sort of implied to already be about her.
Mm-hmm.
But we have these categories within earth worship, which also include the ancestor worship of the Veles and the Laumes, which are like fairies, basically. So that's similar to like in Roman practice, you've got Lares and Penates, the localized tutelary deities. We don't really have a lot of those detailed in here because I couldn't really track down a lot of their names compared to like the Celtic where...
You mean the Laumes?
Yeah.
The fairies? Yeah, and we have that in the other category down here of the fates, the fatal deities. Lima is a Laume. Yeah, she's the queen of the Laumes. She's the leader of them. She's the embodiment of all of them. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Skipping ahead then, I guess, I would like to make a note about that. So what she's getting at is that the fairy goddesses of Baltic and Latvian are these Laumes, and I have in here a section of, there's a singular form, and then there's kind of the collective form. And the writer in the book that we're referring to believes that they might go back to be very far, or very old nature deities, nature spirits, more animistic. Laima is the goddess who's said to have descended to the earth from her like diamond cloud throne and tried to help humanity in any way necessary. And she took on many forms, transformed into all these different fairy types, or at least was a leader of all of them. And so that conception of her as like the mother of them and the mother of fate and the weaver of fate and all these things might have come a little later, crystallizing from all those different fairy accounts. But she's definitely very, very interesting as well. She might relate also to the Lamia of Greek, Libyan, and Basque in Spain, which is very interesting. All those cultures refer to these Lamina or Lamia as these kind of fairy nature goddesses of water, and sometimes, yes, they're violent towards trespassers and whatnot. And then also, I recently discovered in Sumerian there's these protective spirits that are kind of natural and wild. They're called Lama. So once again, finding a few odd Sumerian as well as Mediterranean connections here, which would imply that they're as old as perhaps the Neolithic Revolution, which spread all the way into the Baltic spreading. Agriculture and smithing, all these motifs that you see there could have been inherited by hunter-gatherers from farmers who mixed with them, assimilated. There's a lot, and it's actually hard almost to like make a single entity within the database here that represents that. I have her all the way down here with a few of the other kind of chthonic or ghostly magical deities. A quick note, she's also mother of, or she manifests in many forms, including the weavers. There's the governing goddesses in Lithuanian, which Osteia is one of, and she's got a kind of a beekeeper goddess. And there are many others here. I just can't fit them all. But there's about 7 of them, and it's basically their version of the fates. Like they weave the fates of man, they actually sew it into, they sew the fates of human beings into clothing garments for the gods, which is kind of a really interesting twist on that idea. Is that like the gods wear the clothes of of people's lives? Sounds really interesting to me. Osteia is just one of them, but they instead of 3, there's like 7, and I think they correspond to the Pleiades as well. So that's interesting. But there's even one I mentioned to Calley that I thought was pretty funny. That there's one that actually they always accidentally break the thread, so they kind of represent misfortune and accident and these kinds of things. And then there's another deity that just yells at the person who keeps breaking it, and they're always fighting because she's, trying to make sure everything's done right. So is an interesting little aside. Babilas over here is her partner, her counterpart, also a beekeeper deity. I just thought we would put them in there because it's a very interesting concept. Bees are actually a very important thing. I think I watched a video on YouTube recently about the bee goddesses and gods in many pantheons. But that's a whole episode unto itself, really. Returning to Zemina, I think.
Yeah, so back to what I was trying to say about more nature-oriented of the Laumes. I understand you've got this, the thread and the fates and all that, but Laumes functionally are a bit more like you said, the Lamia or even nymphs in Greek mythology, and so what I was trying to say was that it was just kind of difficult to track down the nymphs who were involved in the stories in kind of the same way that you would find in Greek, where like they're kind of their own tragic characters in of themselves, and there's a lot of their names that we just know and have available. I had trouble tracking those down, I guess, for the more nature-oriented ones, although this seems to be like a very important thing and pretty prominent. The one, I guess, that displays pretty prominently in contemporary practice, so I'll jump to, is Milda, who Josh has here as a potential like emanation or
aspect
of Ausrine.
I have that because there's just a quick note on her. She's very important in contemporary practice, and that's also what the writer says of this book. But like them, I suspect that she might not have been original, because there's many of her aspects and ideas that look like a direct import from the Roman Venus and Greek Aphrodite, and possibly like a later reconstruction of those motifs. I mean, she's also associated with the doves, just like Aphrodite is. You know, that's another connotation there. I think she's actually rides a chariot pulled by doves, which is really cool. I really like that. But yeah, she's kind of similar to that, and also Freya of Norse. She's related in a lot of ways to that, some of her practices, and I think Friday is her sacred day as well, just like Freya. So yeah. Did you have anything else to say about her?
I do. Let me find it.
Mm-hmm. And the reason I say Osrine is very much like that, I mean, if it isn't obvious, Aphrodite, Venus, Veneria is the love goddess. It relates to Ishtar and Inanna in the Middle East, and to Eos, which is an older kind of dawn goddess, sky goddess form. So this dynamic might be the dynamic between like Eos and Aphrodite, who are considered different in Greek too. One's kind of more grounded than the other, but really they both evolve from the same source. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the author goes on to make a similar argument of like, oh, there's lots of people who debate whether she was like a really ancient goddess or not. Nobody cares, okay? As far as contemporary practice and what people actually do, Milda is important because she's basically like the May Queen. And so if you think of like, you know, like the Midsummer movie as kind of a weird allusion to that kind of flower goddess concept, right? Because you have kind of the more chthonic, like Persephone flower goddess situation. This is like the full-blown, just bustling May flower goddess situation of like just pure abundance. And so as far as like the rain dancing and like maypole dancing and those kind of traditions along accompanying the singing, Milda is definitely like the matron of that whole mood. And so she like whether historically that would have been like the same name or anything like that, she's the bearer of the vibe, and so that's
bearer of the vibe.
And just the you know, it's possible that a lot of the Beltane kind of Mayday concepts in, you know, going further west into Europe, like those traditions, it's possible that they kind of originated here. There's an awful lot in here about just the different like matchmaking divination and rituals, and the importance of, you know, getting matched with a good husband. I think partially because of like what Josh was talking about the clothes and stuff like that and the weaving. There's definitely a lot of like fate kind of wrapped into human relationships and like destiny and all of that. So a lot of superstition is kind of put into that. And so I can't find the page exactly, but it does carry on about how like the best, the most auspicious thing to land as a young Baltic lady is a bread father, which is kind of like a sugar daddy except with bread. Bread is very important, and as far as like all of these offerings, like intricacy in baking and baked goods in particular, as well as brewing of beer. So just like the transmutation of wheat and wheat byproducts is eminently important for Baltic people in particular. And so that's probably why the sun is so revered and so focused on just the seasonal rhythmic, you know, thing about the wheat, because it is a very light sensitive plant and needs in the sunlight.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue to talk about Zemina's great son, or his son, her what would you say, star child or golden child, I suppose, is basically it. So there's a motif throughout the world, but in particular in Europe and in some places in the Middle East, of a golden child, chosen one, kind of agricultural deity that is like the perfect man, quintessential man. So when you say bread father, I'm almost thinking, oh well, maybe Milda's partner is actually this guy, Zemulux, who represents the grain, who represents the good harvest, and he's got a pretty impeccable bod as well, I suppose, depending on what form. But in my last video, my major video on the Voltumna connection, I might have sparingly referenced Zemulux at some point, just thrown his name in there, because he is an agricultural deity associated with, basically he's buried every year along with the harvest, or sowing the seeds, that is, and then he is resurrected or grows out of the soil every harvest season, and his prosperity, how much he is has power and fertility over the fields determines how well the harvest is going to go. And then when you take the harvest, you give pieces of the harvest back to him, which is literal in this case. It's back into the soil. So you take part of the harvest and you put it back into the soil, which is really interesting from a perspective of monoculture in America, like this commercial agriculture bullshit we do, because we basically take all the topsoil, we break it down, we add all this material, or just seeds, not really all that. So we add seeds, then we put a bunch of fertilizer, we just pour it on of various chemicals, and then we take all that material out and we sell it. And we don't really, there are some waste products, there are some things that they try to put back in the soil, but when it's monocropping, you don't really have all these different weeds and all these different animals and decomposed material to put back into the soil and to help it to actually add to the soil so that it doesn't just diminish over time. It's a really big issue, the topsoil in America right now. It's just deteriorating because we're not thinking about what we're doing. We're just taking and taking and giving nothing back.
Well, and so that whole point is kind of, the tradition of offering him back to the soil is evidence of perhaps the very ancient roots of hugel culture, which I don't know if you want to pull up a photo, but it's kind of a composting method, a lasagna, if you will.
What is it called?
Layers of decomposing. Hugel culture. I think it's more Scandinavian, but could be Baltic as well.
How do you spell that?
Probably with a weird umlaut. I'm not sure.
Oh no.
Hugel culture.
Hugel culture.
Culture with a K. Yeah, something like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you see this kind of in those northern reaches where they have a lot of dead wood. So part of, so part of forest stewardship, and we see her in this entry for guidebook, who's actually a deity about decomposition and mushrooms, which is kind of a cool, unique concept. They seem to have some awareness about decomposition and composting
Hmm.
as being a vital part of the process. So in Hugel culture, basically you're building like a mound where you take a bunch of sticks and kind of have that as the core. And so you've got these different layers of the compost lasagna that are going to decompose at different rates
Hmm.
and build up heat and create a berming effect. And it's also super convenient for certain kinds of plants where like bending all the way over and harvesting them from the ground is actually super annoying. So having them up on a mound is kind of fun. Strawberries in particular are kind of a fun, but little permaculture aside. They're called strawberries for
Hmm.
those who don't know, because customarily you would need to use straw to kind of heap up and get them off the ground. Because of course, if they're laying in the dirt, they just mush. They
Hmm.
decompose, and they're very sensitive, of course, to animals coming and stealing them. So one technique for strawberries is to get them up on up in height, and you can actually just use an entire straw bale and plant them in there, and then it's kind of fun. You don't have to get down on your hands and knees. They're at a much more comfortable level, and it's good for them. So that's why they're called strawberries, and that's
Hmm.
kind of the idea. The technique is to kind of create these mounds.
Very
So that kind
interesting.
of set the Pushkaitis. He's a minor deity, but I thought he was cool, so we put him in there.
Oh,
For
Pushkaitis, because Pushkaitis is you, is there association that you found with him and strawberries in particular? Is him?
No, just with like the Hugo culture thing, just with the
Oh.
knowledge of decomposition and the um, forest litter in particular, because he's
Hmm.
associated with that. So there's,
Yeah, he's the
in
wild
Eastern
man of the
Europe, you've got
forest. Hmm.
very cool mushrooms. You've got lots of things that you can kind of go out and wild gather in that they would have utilized, and lots of advanced preservation methods, of course, and root cellars and chthonic traditions of like digging and preserving different kinds of foods. And yeah,
Hmm.
because we talked about that 2 times ago or something also, of like what we understand of the range of European food is like really different than what was originally available. They had to they had to get very, very creative with like what was available. So like the apples thing, like yeah, apples would have been kind of a cool, fun thing on the scene during the period that we're talking about here in the Bronze Age. So, tomatoes obviously come from South America. Like all of these things that are kind of staples of European cuisine now that we take for granted, actually like nuts and berries in the forest was like most of it, having to use bark as a unique flavor, like marshmallow or root beer, like all of those kind of things. Like that was the advanced herbalism apothecary that a lot of these that these deities are really uh, talking about, is like the oral tradition and the skills of how to turn seemingly terrible ingredients into very unique flavors. So
Mm.
if you go into any Eastern European, Polish market or anything like that, and you go and you look at like their extract flavors, I find that these are really telling, about kind of the whole vibe of a culture. Is like whatever their weird extract flavors are, because you'll find these at the Asian market, right? You'll get the weird like pandan, lychee, all of these things that like to a Western palate they don't really seem sweet, because we've been bombarded with sugar. But if you go into kind of like the Eastern European, like it's a lot of these like licoricey, herbal,
Mm.
tincture kind of flavors that kind of taste medicinal. They're, when you think of like the taste of Jaeger and you think about like the last time you almost died, like that really rich licoricey flavor. So there's a lot of weird kind of nutty or anisey or like, bitter almond, like things that aren't really like when you think of your favorite flavor, that's not usually the one that comes up. But to the Eastern European palette, like that's a lot of the things that are associated with these deities in particular. So if you're doing some kind of dedication and you're doing baking, it's going to be a lot of weird old worldy kind of stuff like that.
Yeah, and another broad term for this kind of thing is really just permaculture, right? That's a growing thing these days that we constantly are trying to peddle. And permaculture is a non-monoculture, like all these different varieties of food stacked on top of one another in these food forests and just gardens. And that's like the more we look at the Neolithic, and even before the Neolithic with hunter-gatherers, we find that a lot of the world was actually kind of intentionally planted, and seeds were thrown around, and they were brought with them places even before they settled and did agriculture. That permaculture is something that it's actually hard to trace how long we've been doing that, because it would just look like a forest. We always talk about the idea that's new and growing with study of the Amazon today, that they're finding a lot of these species throughout the Amazon might have been intentionally cultivated, not like super extensively, but simply hunter-gatherers moving from one place to another, taking seeds from one place and moving them to the other, and ultimately the entire forest becomes this prosperous Garden of Eden that is actually created by humans. We also see some of that happened in North America with some Amerindian groups, that they actually like burned down forests, and they would try to create these prairies that would have all kinds of things too. It's interesting, even before agriculture, what we call agriculture, that is. So coming back to the mythology, talking about Zemlux a little bit. There's the Voltumna video I talked about. Voltumna is Voltumna and Velkanos and Vertumnus and Attis, and these are various Mediterranean, I would say probably Pelasgian, therefore Neolithic deities. It was the original king of the gods, who is this young, promising, again, golden child, representing the good harvest. And his life cycle every year is he's born out of the soil, and he grows old and eventually dies. And I think his death is usually around the winter solstice, correlating with Christmas. And this is also where Christmas is based on. The Attis myth that I mentioned in that is this god, or this man who died under a pine tree, and then he resurrects every year. He represents the growth of plants and grasses and all these things. So Zemlux is very much in that mythology, and probably goes back to that original Neolithic source of a very important deity in the pantheon. He has a few other names. In Prussian, he seems to be Potrimpo or Altripo. And then a very interesting connection here is Zalmoxis of Dacio-Thracian. The Dacians and Thracians and Phrygians are all related, and they lived in the Baltic. And Zalmoxis is basically this fortune god. He also resurrected. A lot of his myths might have inspired the basis of Dionysus, or at least the Indo-European basis of Dionysus, because other parts of Dionysus probably actually came from this original Velkanos character that we're talking about. So yeah, I wanted to definitely mention that. Another really close connection there, that kind of proves the connection, is Zemina. It was adopted through the Thracians and Dacians in northern Greece by the Greeks as Zemili, or Simile. Even the Etruscans had Semla, but that was probably taken from Greek. But even the Etruscan Semla is the father of Suri, which is a very interesting connection I'll have to talk about at some point. Or mother of Suri, I'm sorry. So there's this sun god kind of connotation here. The resurrecting sun god, the resurrecting fertility god. Dionysus is, of course, the son of Semele and Zeus, according to the later myths. So interesting. So we have a very interesting character here. Another little connection, I have my video on Santa Claus, and I talked a little bit about the Ghost of Christmas Present. And the Ghost of Christmas Present is this exact same motif of he in that case he lived it during a day. So he was born in the morning, died at night. So he lived his entire life in a day, and he just celebrated the present, lived in the present. This is a very Dionysian philosophy. This is life is short, live it. That's what it kind of transformed into over time in the Renaissance and now modern period, and that's why it found its way into the myth of Scrooge, right? But that motif is very much the same. Dionysian, Zemlux, god of wealth and the earth and the cycles, and we all participate in the cycles, and we all live and die.
So important side note, linguistically then about Semele, is that is also where we get semolina type of flour, which is the basis of pasta. And as we know, pasta is life.
Oh wow. Semolina is the basis of pasta? In what way?
It's a different kind of flour. It's got like
Oh,
different ratio. Yeah. It's not like bread
interesting.
flour, actually. Like good pasta is made with semolina. So of course that's
Interesting.
Ina is like a why am I blanking on the word? It's like a cute little uh like Pepito. It's like a, what do they say, diminutive. So that's probably where we get that from, because Semele being this kind of earthy green goddess, but it's refined, I guess, or
Yeah.
like it's
Hmm.
different than Demeter, who's kind of just the big harvest. It's like Semele is kind of like the quiet refinement and perfection kind of aspect,
Mm-hmm.
I guess. So that moves us into Medina, who's an interesting deity, because she's like the goddess of rabbits, and rabbits as an
Yeah.
important protein to the Eastern European people. Josh talked about a couple times ago or something, the advent of chickens and how chickens are fairly new onto the scene
Mm-hmm.
of Europe. They originally came from like around China,
Mm-hmm.
so it wasn't, it's not like you just had this big horde of chickens, and even like getting eggs and things like that was a little more difficult. So the protein that they had, and one that is actually quite efficient, is rabbits, because of course they breed
Mm-hmm.
prolifically and can be kept in captivity quite easily.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
As
and
well as
so they,
pigeons, right? But that's like more in the
pigeon,
Middle East. But they probably did elsewhere too. Pigeons was the Neolithic Western chicken until chickens were traded eventually from the East Asian Neolithic all the way over to the West. And there's a lot of mythic motifs about the rooster and the chicken that seem to be very old and are at the roots of even the Gnostic tradition, Abraxas and stuff. Deep dig there. But these are interesting. Even I mentioned Bang Boutis. He's depicted with a rooster on his head, which is very interesting. Um,
they would have had other kinds of like forest fowl that were just smaller. It just wasn't like the huge
it could be
burly
that
chicken.
originally was, and then like the idea of the phoenix as well. Um, it has some overlap with the chicken motif in East Asia and Southeast Asia as like the hen that laid the golden egg, which is a cosmic egg. There's a similar motif in Orphic of Euronome, uh, this white, and Phanes as well, being born of the egg, like this kind of chicken-like, phoenix-like deity laying the cosmic egg at the dawn of creation. But that's a whole side thing. Back to Medina, I suppose. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, of course, rabbits are kind of the staple of the grassland or the prairie. And so these kind of Eastern European prairie areas are really interesting because they're something that has to be intentionally cultivated. Because normally, when you have an old growth forest, it just kind of is quite dense and spreads itself. And, you know, in studying the creation of prairies, it actually requires megafauna to knock down the trees and create areas of light where you would have
Mm-hmm.
these intermittent prairie regions. So they're in Eastern Europe, all the way up to
Mm-hmm.
kind of the period that we're talking about. There would have been European bison. There would have potentially been oryx still,
And
kind of going into
mammoths.
a little bit.
A,
Yeah,
little earlier on than that, during the Ice Age,
a
yeah,
little bit,
mammoths.
but like they
Mm-hmm.
probably laid the foundation,
Yes.
because they've observed this behavior in elephants and come to study them about perhaps the other megafauna is that they will intentionally kind of pick and choose and curate and knock down trees to create conditions for their own grazing. And deer will do this as well,
Mm-hmm.
to create kind of pockets of safety for themselves kind of amongst the forest so that they have enough of an open area to sprint away from wolves. So prairies are actually really important sanctuaries for deer to be able to kind of make a breakaway and take advantage of their
Mm-hmm.
agility and speed, because in a dense forest deer are actually kind of boned. It's not great. The wolf has a huge advantage, so it's important to have this kind of spotty um,
Mm.
environment. And normally the old growth forest of Eastern Europe in particular very conducive for just growing and growing and growing. So this kind of forest tending that we saw in some of those other deities, and now the emphasis on prairies and rabbits, um, implies like sanctuary, which kind of gets into kind of the harmonia caniculus concept which I introduced.
Yeah, and I can talk a little bit about that. If you could you leave a link to our Discord server in the chat real quick? Because I think Question Reality is working on projects, and we like people that work on projects. We'll help, you know, and we'll provide whatever's needed. We kind of have like that's another thing we do here is when we're in the server. Of course, right now, don't come into the chat because we're streaming this right now, and I can't. The video is the way it is, but we're
this way.
yeah, we're trying to get more people together to work on these kind of things as a community of people who are actually like working on researching and making things, not necessarily just talking, but we do a lot of that too. But at least talking with a database and with a project is it's more stable. It's more it's being built for something. So yeah, I'll answer some of the questions once we finish here. If we finish here, it's getting a little longer than I expected, but I'm enjoying it. I mean, we're going through a lot of ideas here for sure.
We skipped around, so we're more or less getting through it.
Yeah, this is like a true walkthrough of this stuff. But yeah, there's a lot going on. Okay, so about Medina and Zvoruna, I want to treat them in this conversation as almost the same because the tradition itself and Balts themselves and Lithuanians, they do treat them as the same. They're kind of interchangeable. I see a difference, and that difference is mostly between the rabbit and the wolf, right? And these are very opposed things. The wolf chases the rabbits. The rabbit is this, innocent representative of the forest diversity, and the wolf is this, pack animal associated with the moon, and I mean, rabbits are associated with the moon too. But I treat them somewhat separately because in the deck that we made, Calley referred to Harmonia. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but just a little shout out. The Altar Oracle deck here, where I synthesized 72 deity motifs from across the world. One of those motifs is basically the rabbit goddess. And it's not always with a rabbit. In East Asia, there is a rabbit goddess. That's very similar to this one, actually, too. In Mansi religion of the Urals, so that's a Finno-Ugric religion, there's also Kaltesh, who is like the mother goddess, and she's considered to be a rabbit. Medina, to me, speaks of a kind of Eve-like garden maiden, flower maiden goddess who represents the innocence of the forest and the animals therein. Whereas Varuna is kind of more of the hunting goddess. She's got a bit of that Diana aspect in there of Artemis, the hunting goddess, and the moon and the wolves howling at the moon. But I thought I'd want to mention in that motif, the Indo-Europeans have a very important practice that researchers are starting to make sense of in putting together how it is that the Indo-European language spread so quickly. And the general hypothesis now is there was a plague that wiped out a lot of Neolithic people living in Europe at the time. It was the pneumonic plague. It was one of the first. What's that? Marmot.
Marmots.
Yeah, from marmots. It was that animal that actually had. But Cucuteni Trypillian culture, look into them. They were in Ukraine. They were really big. They were a huge culture that had bigger cities than Sumer at the same time. So it was like 4000 BC or something. So they had really dense populations, and that led to plague. And there's actually evidence that they would do the thing that you were talking about, building, basically layering waste in order to. There seems to be some practice of making tills and hills in the Neolithic that people would regularly burn down the town and then build back on top of it. And that might have been a way of attacking plague and cleaning up and cleansing a place once it kind of got old and disrepaired. And a lot of places were built out of wood. It makes sense that they would probably want to, wood decays pretty quickly, especially if it gets wet. They probably just want to regularly.
Yeah, it makes sense to just start from scratch. And with the composting and the hugelkultur, just real quick back, it does during composting it reaches really high temperatures. So these mounds are actually steaming during the winter time, and so that cleanses the bacteria And so, like, keeping food scraps and cleaning bones and things in this way is a great way to reduce rodents and also to kill the bacteria. So that transitions, if we can, into Zaltis and the snakes. If we could.
Oh, I can touch. I wanted to say one thing. Yeah, I want to finish my thought, and then we can go there because that is very related to this plague thing. So the plague is a big part of that hypothesis. I always want to mention because people just had this idea that Indo-Europeans came in and killed everybody and replaced them. No, a lot of them did, and they could get away with that because there was a lot less people, because there was a depopulation that went on before that. And there's a tradition of the early Yamnaya, the horse steppe people, where, and it might have started with something similar to the Baltics in the forest steppe region, is that there were these tribes and there were these villages, which actually have some evidence of pretty prominent maternal or matriarchal kind of structures, that the first son would inherit the home or be part of the tribe, and then every other son would be ceremonial banished when they were of age to go found their own tribes. And so, because of that tradition, and because of the tradition that those men who were called wolves, and some of the words for that actually evolved into our word for werewolf, wolfmen, and also Wolfandir, I forget the Norse term for like a wolf warrior. And this is a motif in like Ares wears a wolf skin. There's a lot of these wolf wearing war gods, like the Romans had a lot of wolf symbology. And this is an old Indo-European, basically dudes going around raping and pillaging stuff. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't say that word. This is YouTube. You know what I mean? Bad stuff. Please don't demonetize. I'm not monetized anyway. Who cares? Okay, so bad stuff happened. There was a tradition of a bunch of incels running around doing bad things, and also the people were, the cities were kind of reeling from the plague at the same time. So that led to potentially the spread. So this wolf motif is very interesting to me, because if it has this Dionic feminine connotation, I wonder how that might have related to that idea of the wild wolves. But anyway,
I think the feminine aspect comes through a little bit more in the Germanic and the nurturing maternal kind of qualities of the wolf, which you do also see in the Roman, right? Of course, with Romulus and Remus being nurtured by the wolf, the will kind of taking them in and actually accepting them. So there's kind of a couple different versions of that, right? We've got the mountain goat who takes in the rejected ones, and also the wolf mother. So we're not going to go too far into that. We'll touch on that another time.
Yeah, so I got some cool paintings. It's cool art that I generated with this one. It was a pretty good prompt. It actually reminds me there was a lot of like wolf paintings. I remember in the 90s, my mom had a few, and I'm like, oh, I wonder what they were getting that from. There's a lot of like kind of fake Native American art, I think, in the 90s that was made by white people doing that basically, but very interesting wolfy motifs.
The whole notion of like the lone wolf and the alpha is like...
Yeah, there's that whole thing too, and that it was disproven later by the same guy that put out the alpha hypothesis.
We're not how wolves work, people don't.
Yeah, let's not. It's all related in that way. Like the incel thing, there's something going on with that particular motif for sure. But going to Zaltis that she mentioned.
Undesirable structure.
Undesirable structure.
That's that way for a reason. And this is in the absence, right? We're talking about the time period. This is in the absence of organized war. So, like these raiding parties that you're talking about that end up being a model that, of course, you know, the Vikings use later on. And all the raiding is just not necessary. It's not nice. Don't do it. We're not perpetuating that as a good way to be. But we're observing kind of the pattern of how that came to be.
I don't think anyone
kind of
would.
the standard way of dealing with that whole thing when there's not enough resources to go around.
Yeah, so you're mentioning Zaltis, and that was like a tangent, but it's a meaningful tangent. So why she mentioned that in the context of plagues is I mentioned in my Voltumna video an important Indo-European deity, Velnos, who evolved into Veles, and I will talk about his version in Baltic in Vilnius soon, but Velnos in Indo-European he's basically a snake or a snake deity that protected the horse stable or the stable or the home. In Baltic, there's Zaltis, which are these. It's a literal practice, so it's not just like, oh, there's these snake gods and they exist. It's literally the snakes. So green snakes in the Baltic were these sacred animals. They would want to. It was a general practice to bring them into the home. My voice is like going away now or something. I'll be good. They would want to bring a snake into the home, and they would basically sleep under. That's why I have the picture here. They would sleep under the hearth because it was warm, or the stove later on when stoves existed, and or under the home or whatever. And when they were there, they were thought to bring good luck and fortune. Basically, a snaky version of a horde dragon. So like a dragon that gives you fortune, it holds fortune. There's all these motifs about like when you. Sometimes the snakes are very helpful. Sometimes they're like pretty rude and mean, and they come into your home and they're like, give me wealth, give me things, go steal that person's thing. Like they would get people to steal stuff, or they themselves would steal stuff and hoard it in your home, and you get in trouble if authorities found out that this was happening. But people would be like, I don't know, we have to do what the snake tells us to do. So there's all these like kind of weird stories like that where these snakes these little horde dragons are getting into people's houses and corrupting them.
Basically, they're bringing in these snakes. These are like the equivalent of like the feral Disneyland cats, where they had vermin problem, and for whatever reason, cats don't seem to show up as prominently in like Baltic. So snakes seem to be kind of the solution, and they were pretty easy to domesticate because, of course, it is cold there. So having a stove is like a super bonus to a snake. So like, of course, during the warm months, there's snakes all over the place. But for them to be able to overwinter, they form this kind of symbiotic relationship. So you would just have these snakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Non-venomous.
So yeah, and that's important, and that's something that's across the globe wherever snakes are sacred, and this happens in Korea as well. There's a similar myth, which was very interesting, where snakes are sacred in the home because they eat vermin. Same reason that we like cats, same reason we like ferrets and other vermin catching animals. And so they were sacred in the home. That's why we mentioned with our Gaelic Irish story about St. Patrick banished all the snakes from Ireland supposedly, and how shortly after there was a big plague. And I'm just like, oh, I think I know why. Because you need the snakes to stop that from happening. So that's the little connection that you're talking about with the Cucuteni plague and snakes and the Indo-Europeans and the Baltic. Yeah, there's a lot going on with the serpentine motifs with a lot of these cultures. I think very quickly I'd like to tell one little story. The super Cliff Notes version. There's a story that's really famous in Lithuanian, which is Zilvinus and Eagle. And essentially it's this motif that apparently is around the world in various contexts. This one is pretty hashed out. It's a very like complete story where essentially a snake, one of these Zaltese snakes, she found him in like her sleeve of her shirt when she was changing, and this Egil is her name. She's a mortal, just a normal mortal chick in a house with a family, and this snake says, "Hey, I'll leave if you marry me," and she's all like, "Okay," and not knowing the ramifications. And after a few days, a host of snakes came slithering into the yard, and her family and the village was all like, they gave her like 3 different animals in a row. It was like saying that was her, saying just take this and leave, basically. And they came back every time, and they're just like, no, come on. And so they threatened her with a famine and also or I think it was a drought, and then with a flood, which is another motif that throughout the world, like Vritra and Vedic, the serpent is associated with drought and with flood, with either or, which is another, it makes sense in this story. They would have power over that. So they took her to basically a lagoon, and in this lagoon on some island in a place, it's somewhere in Prussia, modern Prussia, where this is said to be, I think, or near Poland, actually, might be a Polish city now. They brought her down under the lagoon and under the sea, somewhere in the Baltic, and there was a palace there where she met the king of the snakes, and his name was Silvanus. And they lived happily ever after. He was not a bad dude. He was human form. They just got along. But she also had kind of like a memory lapse in a way, because she's living in this magical realm, and this is a motif often when they go to another world, like in Celtic. You start to forget the real world. And so she remembered randomly when one of her three sons asked her about her family, and she was like, oh wow, I should go see them. And in a few myths, she asks Silvanus if she can go see them. And he says yes. Sometimes he's reluctant, but says yes ultimately. And basically all the children are allowed to go and see the family, and they're given this special code on this special spell to conjure him and to go back to his land if they need to. And so she goes back to her family, talks with them, meets with them, and then in secret, her brothers, and there's 12 brothers, and this is kind of interesting. They basically threaten and torture her sons in secret and try to get them to give up the spell to summon the snake king.
This is why they should have been sent away. This is ridiculous. See, all of this is like explaining why
those 12 sons should have been sent away. Yeah. And so the three sons didn't give it up, but the youngest daughter was the most scared, and she gave it up. And so they took that, they summoned him, and they killed him with scythes, actually. They took a bunch of scythes and cut him up. And that's really interesting because it kind of almost sounds like the Kronos situation. And it also sounds a little bit like the 12 sons of Jacob trying to kill Joseph, which is actually interesting too, because he's also kind of attacked, and they're all jealous of him, and they put him into the well, and then he becomes a slave, comes back, and gets his vengeance, so to speak, or whatever. But I thought that was interesting there too, because Joseph has to do with rainbows, and rainbows has the serpent connotations elsewhere. My brain just starts going, So anyway, they successfully kill him. When she goes back to the lake to try to summon him with the spell, blood comes up out of the water, which is a signal that he's dead. And she finds out what happened, and so she transforms all of her children and herself into trees, different kinds of trees. And that's basically the story. So that's that one. Interesting.
Bread daddy.
They killed the bread daddy. He was a nice guy. I don't know if he was bread, but there's another connotation that like he's in the sea, so there's a sea serpent. It's interesting. The Nagaraja, the king of the serpents, is in a lot of mythologies. So is there anything else to say about that, or we go back to probably Pushkaitis?
No, I think we can skip on ahead. We gotta wrap stuff.
We gotta wrap it. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So let's make sure we spend a good time on. Let's go to Vilnius.
Yes, let's go down here.
Because we already introduced Lima and the bees and all that.
This will be the last section here. We'll talk about the deities of death and that whole thing. Yep, that's a good way to wrap it up, and fittingly in the end. So I mentioned earlier that Velnos is related to Veles. Vilnius is linguistically, that is not the right art form right there, by the way. Did I do that? I must have done that on accident. That's Menes, the moon god, in there. So we might have to update that copy when we get the chance. Okay.
I asked you if you did the pictures.
I did the pictures, but that one is not Vilnius. Okay, so here's Vilnius. A little different. Not too different. But yeah, he is... It's so weird to end on this because there's so much about him I could say, but I want to leave it up to other people to research as well. He's most likely linguistically related to Veles because he's a god of death, and he's got some. He's a psychopomp in particular. So this is a particular kind of death god that isn't necessarily chthonic. He is considered to be in the underworld from time to time, but his actual duties involve ferrying the souls, which are called the Veles in Lithuanian. Veles is a term for like ancestral souls, across the sky into the far west to the underworld. So that's a motif that is everywhere. The oldest versions of Odin we know of have that job as the Great Hunt. The myth of the Great Hunt is Odin and his hounds and his Sleipnir horse. They gallop across the sky, summoning all of the spirits and ghosts of the ancestors, and basically shepherding them across the sky into the far west, into the underworld. And it's a very interesting motif. Many people relate that to why Odin and Velnius and Veles are like Santa Claus. It's a little loose, but it's still interesting, is that he's flying across the sky and he's got a bunch of animals that he's herding and perhaps spirits. The relationship in particular, the really interesting myth that we discovered in this book with Velnius, is that every winter solstice, so around the time of Christmas, he summons the spirits of the dead, the ancestors, the Veles. That's us. That's our ancestors. That's us when we die. He summons us in spirit form to fight against Regana, the goddess of darkness and winter, the old crone of darkness and winter, to try to bring back the power of the sun. And that's a really interesting motif. There's basically two battles. And Regana down here, she's like the witch, the winter crone, warlock situation. In the summer solstice, she leads an army of Reganas, which are witches in general, these demonic spirits or just spirits of kind of death and decay, to fight against Solia and to push her back, because in the summer solstice she's at the greatest extent. She's, her light is hitting everywhere, and it's the warmest it can be. The summer is at its height. So she, and here's the rationale behind it, she sees that will lead ultimately to drought and death. And so we don't have to think about it in a demonic way. Regana sees, and the witches see, that too much sun would be a problem. And so they fight and push back that energy. And that leads, for the rest of the year until winter solstice, that leads Solia's power to slowly diminish from fall into winter. And then Velnius comes and pushes the power back in the other direction from winter solstice to summer solstice, where the power of the sun comes back around. So that's probably one of the most interesting things. And it relates, again, that idea, like I said, like Odin and all these other psychopomps, that they lead spirits against something or towards something in the sky. And they're particular dusk sky like deities, not always underworld per se. He's also depicted on a horse. That's very important because horses are an Indo-European thing. So that particular version of him probably came about after that point, and maybe wasn't a Neolithic deity. The Neolithic version of him with Veles is interesting because the correspondence, because I was relating Odin to this, but in Norse pantheon, Veles, who's, by the way, a Slavic deity, who's the equivalent of Velnius. In Norse, Veles is Vili, or Lothar, or Elder Loki. He's more like Loki. And that's very much distinguished from Odin. Now, Vili is one of the three brothers, or twins, or whatever, triplets of Odin. So there's Odin, and Vili, and then Ve. But Lothar Vili is credited with creating humankind, or at least giving us the breath of life. And that's very interesting when we consider that Veles' definition of our ancestral ghost spirit self. In Lithuanian, the idea of the Veles is that they, in your breath, that becomes this ghost, and it could go into anything nearby. It can go into another animal. It could go into a tree, which is considered to be a sacred, good honor to be. It could go back into the underworld if it's kind of reaved by Velnius as he passes. So there's all these places that your spirit, your Veli, can go when you die, and it is very much related to breath and wind and all those motifs. So I thought that's very, very interesting. But again, it's a little confusing because it's like Veles of Slavic is a serpentine god. He ultimately evolved into being identical with Jormungandr. Basically, he's at the bottom of the world tree, and Perkunas, the thunder god we mentioned, or Thor in Norse, stands atop the tree and shoots down at the serpent as it tries to climb up every year. And so we see that seasonality there that's really indicative of some of this Velnius myth. And it makes you wonder, it's like, is there a similarity here in motifs? Because in the winter solstice, if Jormungandr, Velnius is coming from the underworld up to the top, and then he's shot down by the thunder god, or otherwise he fights Reganas to restore the power of the sun, it's all kind of blending together in an interesting way. There's some that seem as demonized, and some ways you can interpret it as a good thing that he's doing. Another note about that I wanted to mention with, I didn't mention too much about Perkunas, but Perkunas is equivalent to Perun in Slavic, and in Slavic myth, that's the story I talked about many times, with Veles being turning into a serpent and spiraling up the world tree and being shot down by Perun. So there's a similar kind of dynamic potentially happening between Perkunas and Velnius here. And in Lithuanian and Baltic myth, it's actually, the idea is that Perkunas is constantly hunting Velnius, and Velnius kind of hides in the swamps and the rivers and he's transformative. That's another important motif, why he's more like Veles. Odin transforms too, though, so it's interesting. But he transforms into the various things kind of hiding in various forms, and Perkunas is constantly playing hide and seek and trying to shoot him with lightning bolts. It's part of why that's part of the explanation for why lightning bolts happen and why they're just shooting trees and stuff all the place, because they're hunting him. And he never catches him. Like Velnius always gets away. And the thing about Perkunas, this dynamic, is the two are almost like twins. They're almost like sons of Daivas, the Sky Father. One of them, Perkunas, is like really a stout, and he's all about justice and righteousness, and he's trying to enact the will of his father, whereas Velnius is thinking for himself and actually might have been more responsible for the creation of the earth and life in general. And so he's similar to like the demiurge in like Gnostic, where the Sky Father is kind of detached. He's like, hey, go make the world and stuff. But then there's the Perkunas, who's trying to make it the way is specified, almost like a smithing god like Keleveles. Keleveles is maybe potentially identical to Perkunas in this sense. And then Velnius is doing all the dirty work that it takes to actually build and mold and create the earth and life and evolution and all these more dynamic ideas. So yeah, I thought I want to mention that as a very important dichotomy going on. A quick note on Velumate, very obscure again, mate, therefore Latvian. Based on the name being counterpart of Velnius, she is depicted, or she is said to be the mother goddess of the underworld and of death. She's got a few different epithets, like Mother of the Veil is what Velumate means, but she's also a mother of graves. And just all these death motifs, she's kind of got, again, an army of spirits and ghosts that she watches over in the underworld. So I thought that was very much in line with Velnius. It made sense to me for them to be partners down here in some way. And Velumate, actually, I always talk about Etruscan. She's very similar to Mania, and therefore to a few of those other, if I can click on it here real quick, a goddess of ghosts and death. So she, Melino is like the Greek version of Mania, and she's a goddess of nightmares and ghosts and insanity. Hela is actually a lot like her as well, probably even more so because Norse is very nearby. Hela has part dead, part alive. Um, as Corey Persephone in the chat is an expert on, this Velamate is possibly the dark chthonic aspect of Kore, or of Persephone in a way, and that's a motif of the death goddess being that way. There's no motif of her having a necessarily flowery form. If I were to be speculative and say so, I would like to say that she's Medina during part of the year. The rabbit goddess here, forest mother, and then during the other part she's down there. But that's pure speculation and fun on my part, and reading too much in between things. I mentioned Regana already a bunch. She's the witch. She is responsible again for winter and for all these magical forces. She's kind of a trickster. She's become portrayed as a quintessential witch, riding a broom. Some other depictions that are a little older say that she was actually riding like a raven or a crow, and I thought that was really cool because in the Pandemonic associations, the corvid is one of the kind of markers that we have, and the corvid is related to dusk deities, and so Regana in that way is very similar to kind of Morrigan. Morana is the name for her in Slavic. Just the death goddess, particularly of dusk and of the sky. Because again, Regana is not a chthonic deity. She's a sky, dark, ghostly, windy deity. And for that reason, I see her more as dusk. In my database here, I actually don't have chthonic as one of the things. I often do. This time, I decided that there's so little that's explicitly chthonic and underworld about these deities in particular that I, like some of these darker ones, I just consider to be dusk. Darkness, night, basically, as a motif, more so than just explicitly underworld, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah. Just like how Irish was missing like purely sky in
Yeah.
a way that like its neighbors actually have it prominently, more to like Welsh has actually lots of it, but not so much for Irish. So same thing. Yeah, it's as hard as we tried to find it. There didn't seem to be quite the same concept for like the dark cavey underworld. They were often like either watery, like the lagoon situation, or the island at the edge of the earth or whatever, but it wasn't really quite go down a cave and go see Pluto or
Last final note, because we did skip it, but it takes 2 seconds to say, Pushkaitis, he is the wild man. He's a dwarf who sees to the health of the woods. He's kind of like Treebeard. There's a wild man deity or demigod across the world, including Sasquatch and Bigfoot. Those are the same motif actually. When you look deeper into it across Eurasia and into the Americas and such. He's not quite like Pan. Pan is somewhat similar in ways he is, but I think Bearstuk is the Polish or Slavic name for him, or he's said to be actually like a leader of the Bearstuk, which I always think of Bear Walk because we have our Michigan Moonlight, whatever that movie is, I forget. Escanaba in the Moonlight, yeah, that movie I really love because it's got a bear walk or what's the name of the Wendigo? It's got a Wendigo in there, and like kind of the Michigander name for the Wendigo is the Bear Walk, and Bearstuk in some ways is kind of similar. This wild man of the forest, not explicitly said to look like a deer or anything like that. I don't think he's necessarily shapeshifts that much either, but yeah, just throwing that in there at the end. There we go. We got everything. It's only we're at the 2-hour mark, so I guess the rest we can do Q&A, and the rest can be however long we can stand it.
Yeah, so please put the questions here in the chat. That's easiest to respond to it. We'll, of course, you're welcome to pop in the Discord, and we do Q&A. The general experiment that we're running with is doing this thing on Sunday around this time. We're going to try to kind of prepare a presentation to be kind of the first part, just to give give some value. We don't have quite as much time as we used to for just pumping out videos and having lots of like long form educational ones. So we thought, what would be great is if we could kind of combine worlds and have a video that had a good chunk of educational stuff on the replay to kind of serve as like the intro for the Q&A session and give something to start with, and then bust into Q&A. So in the future, we'll try to tighten it up. But this was the first week we really experimented with the chart guide wombo combo with the stream presentation all the way through. So pardon our dust, we're still refining the format and trying to, get it as good as it can be. Then we do follow that up every Wednesday. We have open studio session in the Discord, which you're welcome to come in and hang. It's kind of like a creative accountability session where we're just doing work on stuff we were going to do anyway. So everybody's got something kind of different. We've got, a programmer. I'm usually there on Photoshop doing some working on backlog. And then Josh is usually there streaming research, and so it's kind of an open Q&A at that time as well, just touching base throughout the week. But we're hoping, I think, in the future to try to kind of give a sneak peek of what we're working on midweek as far as the next Pantheon we're really researching. But we have a really big backlog to go through. So I think unless somebody has some serious feedback pointing us to the contrary, we're going to try and go back to some of the charts that Josh has already prepared and kind of fill out the guides or do a Q&A about it, just to kind of catch up to where we've already gotten through of the pantheons that have been fleshed out a little bit already. And that's partly to get it caught up to where we're at in the database, because all of those entries have been a little bit more filled out, and we want to at least like present them. Like that's the whole purpose of doing all the research. And then also tidy up so we can move on, because we've got a lot on the docket for doing more of these kind of start to finish. This was an example, like I mentioned earlier, I had no idea. I have not really been exposed to this pantheon at all, so it was really fun to do something totally new. Josh was a little more versed, but I think maybe more on the Slavic end. So we'll go back and we'll probably do a separate Slavic one.
Oh, yeah, pretty closely related, but still different enough. It would definitely not be right to put them all in one here. I felt like, although Latvian has a lot of different names for some of the same things, and the Montes, there's just so many. I have to actually do more research on correlating more of that anyway. But Lithuanian basically gets, and again, there's things in here that are Latvian and not Lithuanian. There's things in here that are mostly both of them, and the word choice is just arbitrary, really, like which word I went for the Lithuanian or Latvian. So that's why I say Baltic. This is Lithuanian and Latvian also at the same time. So to start answering some of these questions, maybe I'll move up from the bottom and then come back down to capture some of these things. Question in reality, you're asking, is he a satyr in referring to Pushkaitis? I haven't seen any record of him being referred to that way. He doesn't seem to shapeshift at all. He seems to merely take the form of a dwarf and tend to the woods. His Polish form and Prussian, because, okay, another note I wanted to mention, Calley, that you might not know explicitly, but a whole lot of Polish deities, particularly natural ones like this, probably came from Prussian and Polish, really Vestic or Wendic, Slavic, Lechetic, I think they call it sometimes. That's a smaller subset. But I'm actually Czech. Calley, you're Polish as well. You're Polish, I'm Czech. So we both have a little bit of that Wendic in our background as well. Just want to mention that for fun. But Wendic would be Czechoslovakian, Polish, Pomeranian, which doesn't exist anymore, and Sorbian, which there's very small percentages of people still in that. There's actually, Pomeranian's really interesting stuff. If I was doing Slavic, I would almost entertain doing West and East differently. I think South has mostly a lot of East stuff anyway, so it wouldn't be different, but probably just doing one big Slavic one. But anyway, Bearstuk, he doesn't have any sort of shape-shifting explicitly either. It's just, again, these dwarves and their groups of dwarves attending to the health of the forest.
So, one note that's kind of interesting about the Wendigo concept that I'm going to bring up because I just finished reading Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's a great book. I definitely recommend it, but it was, I thought, a little long. And the most poignant chapter was kind of at the end, which was specifically about the Wendigo and the concept of, um, where they come from, that they're kind of this corrupted human who uh, did cannibalism, basically. Like, you become a Wendigo by resorting to cannibalism, and it's this spirit of insatiable hunger, and it's kind of this curse and this punishment for doing that during the lean times. And it's like a punishment for not being prepared enough and not taking care during the plentiful season to make sure that you don't have to do that, or like to keep your population in check and to employ sustainability practices. So in the Braiding Sweetgrass book, of course, that's a Native American perspective. And so the emphasis is really on sustainability, and the author's background is in uh, horticulture. So a lot of that is very like plant-based. You need to be doing the herbalism things and tending to the ecosystem to prevent cannibalism ultimately. And this kind of reciprocity and interconnectedness of things was, I think, the loudest signal from this book about the Baltic tradition, like the importance of giving when you take, and creating this reciprocal relationship, both with the watery aspects, like we talked about being Buddhists and making offerings, but also to the earth-based deities and making offerings and being in right relationship with the environment. And so if we did go forth and do more of like the Slavic angle of that, of course, I'm sure everybody is more familiar with, yes, little ham there, with Baba Yaga, who we were kind of interested in the relationship between like the Regana goddess.
Yeah, I
and
didn't mention
Baba
that
Yaga,
connection,
whole
but
thing.
she's often treated as Baba Yaga. But like again, that Morrigan thing, not always old, not always a crone, is always a distinction, but it doesn't have to be. They could like Morrigan also
Well,
transforms into they're very similar in some ways.
I think perhaps the Vedic continuity there actually brings her more related to like Rangda in Indonesian, or like
Mm,
Ravana, the king of demons. So that
mm,
demonic force, as far as like the desperation or cannibalism, I think that it not so much in the one we just discussed, but like more like Rangda. Obviously, she's a kind of a devourer, or kind of like got that cannibal thing going on as well, and how there's the dichotomy in Indonesian between Rangda and Barong, which is a sun deity, and
mm-hmm.
like the sun being kind of opposed to this darkness, and the cannibalism stuff kind of being um, connected to, corruption and darkness in
Mm-hmm.
some way. But really, what it is, it's not like evil, and like they don't seem to have the same kind of like Christian concept of like evil or dark or malicious in that satanic kind of way. Although, of course, later reads by the Teutonic Knights certainly tried to push that agenda, but it seems to be more that like there is just this possibility of this inner corruption, but that's kind of characterized more by like this ill fate concept, just like this unfortunate fate, rather than some willful malice. Um, but that also, like deception in particular, like Josh was talking about, the myth of like the hiding, is punished by the Perkunas, by the sky deity of lightning.
Mm-hmm.
About if you're doing sneaky stuff, it's going to be found out and punished, kind of thing. And the myth that he talked about, punishing the moon for his infidelity. Thunder God doesn't like that. That's not kosher. So he got chopped up and stuff.
Which is very different from Zeus, because Zeus is very unfaithful. So that just indicates more that Zeus is not really purely the Indo-European Perkunas. He's not even like Marduk or Tarhuna or Thor in too many ways. He's got the Chaos Comp. He's killed some monsters, but that's about as heroic as he usually is. He's often punishing people unfairly or tricking or messing around, So that's another topic, but it's interesting to see it that way too. My argument for why that is I think Zeus has been taken from other sources. For instance, parts of Velkanos in the Minoan tradition, or Velkanos. Cretan Zeus is not an Indo-European Zeus, but a Pelasgian Zeus that was before that, wasn't called that, and didn't have all the same myths. But anyway, you mentioned Ravana a little bit. That's actually an interesting connection. I hadn't made that exact connection yet, but it actually fits pretty well in a way, because I see Ravana, and this is, I've never made a video about this. I wanted to make a video explicitly about the dusk god, who I call Wanderus or Wanderus in my altar oracle, and that's Odin, that's Horus, which are already interesting enough, but then there's Ravana, and there's also Baidi, I think, in Chinese. He's the northern dark god, black god that comes and makes messes. And in the Chinese story, there's a similarity between Ravana's story with the 10 heads and the 10 crows in the Chinese, that are sons of the sun goddess, Shi. And she has some similarities with Amaterasu in Japan, also Sun and Soleil in this situation, where all these different crows are vying to become king of the sun. And then 9 of them are shot out of the sky by the archer god, who's similar to Rama in the case of Ravana, but is Hori in other cases. And there's also the Norse myth of Hoder, who's blind and is tricked by Loki into shooting Balder, the sun god, and he dies and is resurrected. So there's some stuff going on there. I have to dig deeper, but I definitely see a pattern. And Velnius, the Odin aspect at least, is similar to Ravana, but to have this interesting flipping going on where Regana is this winter goddess and is fighting Velnius, it's interesting. Not sure what to make of it yet, but it's very interesting. Your Rangda and Bahram connection is very cool too, because Bahram, the sun, the lion-faced sun god, actually has a lot in common with Hanuman, who's a monkey, and Onerus in Egyptian, who's this heroic lion guy who's conflated with Hercules in Greek. And Hercules, of course, wears the lion's pelt. And I found some linguistic similarities, Bahram and Bahram in Iranian, as well as this heroic deity associated with kind of restoring order. It's very interesting. That's another weird place, weird rabbit hole to go down.
And then, of course, Sun Wukong, who is kind of a chaotic deity, but also inadvertently brings order through heroic leadership that is kind of inevitable, I guess, like the inevitability of that kind of companionship, I guess, as being ultimately redemptive in the face of kind of that solo main hero energy, arrogance that he begins with when he's like taunting Buddha and stuff. So there's a question here about Medina and the cosmic egg.
Is that the most recent question? Yeah, I wasn't seeing too many questions further back, so I can come back down to wherever this is.
Well, that's why that one's an actual question. What were you bringing up about the cosmic egg?
Me? What?
Seems to be you, yeah. I didn't bring it up.
In the comments?
Reading the comments, there is a question for you. You brought up some connection between Phoenix, Medina, and the cosmic golden egg. Can you clarify?
I don't know why. I'm trying to find... There's just so many comments here. I'm trying to find where that question was.
Why don't you just let me filter it then?
Sure. I just have this thing where, like, I can't think unless I read something. Like, it's hard to, like, compute the words. Is it on the very bottom somewhere?
No, it's not on the bottom.
It's somewhere in the middle of all this. Okay, just ask me it again. I'm sorry. Ask me again. I keep getting a fuzzy camera for some reason. Not sure why.
Or what were you talking about earlier? How is Medina related to the phoenix cosmic egg?
Um, I know I talked about the cosmic egg and the hen and the rooster and the chicken. We talked about that. And okay, so that's right. Calley was talking about how rabbits are a staple for like hunter gatherers, and in really just also in the region. They're just a regular staple, a small animal for hunting. And for whatever reason, we tangented from that conversation to talk about chickens. Oh, I think it's because I said pigeons are also a staple that were like replacing chickens. Like, it was just a bad tangent, but it's still interesting. Medina related to that? No, I don't think necessarily related to pigeons or chickens. And the pigeon dove thing would be more Milda, if anything, but I'm not seeing necessarily that. The relationship of maybe a dove or a pigeon to Aphrodite, I suspect, might have something to do with the pigeons being messengers, being domesticated, and they represent peace, harmony, or doves represent peace, harmony. But I always think of like the ark, the Great Flood and the Ark and Noah story, where the doves are reporting if there's land and whatnot, and they're like messengers in that sense. But yeah, I mean, I'm just going off at this point. I'm not sure. Yeah, in this pantheon, if anything is related to the cosmic egg, it's whatever Bang Putis. Why does he have a rooster on his head? You know, that's a. I don't actually know. In all my study, like he just has the rooster on his head. What does that represent? The closest I can get to it in my interpretation, as elaborate as it might be, is you know how he drowns. He tries to drown Osteros here, Oseklis, and that's a little ironic because in a holistic look at Lucifer and the dawn god is a rooster is representing the dawn god. I mentioned Abraxas. Then there's Phanes in the Orphic tradition, who is the first god, the god of light, god of dawn. His light emanates out into all the other deities. That's very much a rooster, chicken, rooster in particular motif. And so, like, I'm wondering if Bang Putis has some relationship to the dawn rooster. Because there's another word, Ostris cox is the name for the dawn tree, and that's the world tree in Baltic, and that's the golden apple tree in the far west, sitting on an island somewhere in the ocean. And on top of that tree, we didn't mention specifically, they say it's either that Sole either sleeps in a tree or a silver castle, and I kind of see it as a silver castle atop the tree, kind of like Asgard on top of the Jormungand, or, you know, Yggdrasil. So that's kind of how I prefer to look at it. And so I almost think of like Oseklis. I was entertaining with some of my art. I think I generated it even. And Calley kind of pushed me away from it because she's like, where are you getting this? And I'm like, it's my elaborate, it's my elaborate pattern recognition, I suppose. But yeah, I went against depicting him as a tree. But I believe there's a few back here. Or did I not? I didn't add it, actually. I had something where I depict him as this kind of like a white elm tree. Sitting on an island, so that because there's a lot of overlap between the myth of the world tree and the first man or woman or both. In Norse, it's Ask and Embla, who are together the first man, woman, and they're both trees that were turned into humans. And of course, in Baltic, we have that story about Egil, where her children were turned into trees, and herself too. There's kind of that motif going on. In Celtic, you got the multiple world trees, or different trees representing different motifs as well. So sometimes when I see a world tree, I simultaneously see a tree and also a deity like Atlas holding up the world. And this first tomb Phanes figure, and even the Caduceus we talk about all the time, Persephone, about the Meduceus being a tree with two serpents around it. So it's the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. The staff itself represents the tree, and the axis mundi with the serpents coming up it. Jormungandr, the world serpent, is on the bottom. The heavens are on the top. It's the bridge between all those worlds. So as a messenger god, it makes sense. Hermes is a bridge between the worlds. I didn't mention actually the Deva Devi, the twins, who would have corresponded in a way to Hermes and the Geminian motif. They are also messengers of Divas. They gallop down the tree, up and down the tree, to relay messages between the underworld, the earth, and the sky, or the heavens. So that's another thing. Apart from also being the horse that draw the chariot across the sky. They're kind of doing everything. I wonder how they managed to do it all. But that's a big dump of everything related to a cosmic egg.
Well, one thing that's interesting to note, like we talked about, when exactly did chickens come on the scene? The sign for Pisces, evidently, in the Baltic zodiac is actually the crane. And so this time of year, I don't know if you heard earlier in this broadcast, we had some cranes passing over, so you can hear those here. Normally they're migratory. A few pairs seem to have overwintered with us here, which is a little concerning. But cranes are interesting, and we mentioned them a little bit under the Celtic as well. In Gaul, they were very important animals, and here in Baltic, we see them as important both for like fertility, like where we get the myth of like cranes bringing, or storks, I guess, bringing babies, that whole thing. So it could be that the eggs are more of a crane type flavor rather than chickens, and the eggs perhaps that they would have had access to would have maybe been more speckled and maybe been more small. Probably not the chicken but it does say we're here kind of in the Ostara time frame, and we've got Easter coming up. Obviously, Easter very significant in Eastern Europe and Orthodox kind of areas, lots of celebrations, lots of traditions. But if you are so inclined, I found in this section of the book, it's got these here.
The sigils?
Those glyphs are particularly appropriate for painting on eggs.
Oh.
If you are doing an egg paint, if you can afford it, because they're worth their weight in gold right now. But in particular, if you are doing this egg ritual, it's associated in Baltic, like the coloring of the eggs, they would be colored and put on the graves of ancestors. And this was thought to kind of create some connection for reincarnation purposes, or to kind of welcome the ancestral souls back into the family line, or to kind of keep it in the family.
Interesting.
So this was an offering that would be made, and if you look up online, there's tons of really intricate, like Eastern Europe, like using wax and stuff to create just ridiculously intricate patterns that kind of mirror like the weaving or embroidery style patterns, just really intricate like floral motifs. Eastern Europeans go hard when it comes to like the egg tradition. One thing that's kind of interesting in Germanic is my grandma had a tradition that was, I have to mention this because it's Easter, and this, in hindsight, this is a little unhinged. It's kind of crazy. I don't have any photos of them, but my grandma would make these sugar eggs where like the shells, there would be like a top and bottom shell, and it would be hollow, and so there was room to put like a little diorama. And she had this hoard, like this was just like her thing, and something that she did, because she did baking and did like wedding cakes and fancy stuff like that, but also did these weird eggs. And usually it would be like a colored bottom and a white top, and then you would do frosting all the way around to seal it in, and put a little piece of plastic to create like a little window. And you would get little plastic bee-boos, and she would actually pipe like these crazy intricate flowers. So this is part of this Germanic Milda tradition. I think she was very much in tune with that, because of course she's a Taurus. the problem with all of it, and she involved me and she taught me how to do this. I could probably do it if I put my mind to it. There's like special molds to make these eggs. It's all very strange. They're like this big. They're like not small. But the problem is, if you go into our family collection, you're going to find kind of a concave mark on the bottom of every one of them where I would secretly go and lick them because they're made of sugar. And when I was young, I just couldn't help myself.
Sugar off.
Not the most shelf life thing. Yeah, like probably not the thing you want to be storing in great quantities, but we've probably still got, you know, a few dozen of the ones that she made and I made with her together. But a lot of them have either these like teeth marks. Yeah.
Biting them, shaving them off. Well, it's interesting that you see like the Milde connection there, and I can see that with generally the idea of Ostara in Germanic, basis of Easter as a holiday, and Ostara is generally the dawn goddess. The I think, yeah, Husos and Aurora and Eos are all related to that same linguistic root. Ostara, oddly enough, for this pantheon, it's always where stuff gets complicated sometimes. She has a lot of that rabbit motif, right? Because Easter's all about the rabbit stuff. But the eggs, obviously, rabbits don't lay eggs. It's chickens that lay eggs, and even at least pigeons that used to lay eggs, right? Pigeons and doves, just birds in general. So like I see the Libra, Aurora, dawn goddess connection as more having to do with chicken and pigeons and birds and egg stuff, whereas the rabbit stuff I see more with Medina as a grounded sort of Persephone, earthy idea. So it's interesting how with Ostara she's very much associated with both of those things, and then she's associated with the spring in particular, and so that has a lot more of that flower maiden connotation with Persephone. And so that's one intersection where like sometimes Ishtar and Persephone are conflated together despite having really quite unique motifs outside of that context. It's still interesting for sure, though. I know we talk about that a lot over here. Make planet, Easter Island. I think I've heard Make in my database. No? Okay. So that's the name for Easter Island, huh? I don't remember why Easter Island was called that. I don't know if it had anything to do. It's the farthest east, maybe? Maybe that's why they called it, because it's the very farthest east Polynesian island you can get to. But the interesting thing about that is that they definitely got to South America at some point and traded for sweet potatoes, because we found those in the old world a long time ago. And potatoes are all from South America, so it's kind of cray. Yeah. All right.
But yeah, I assume Pishanki is probably the pronunciation, something along those lines. Yeah, that's totally what I'm talking about. I didn't know the word for those. I guess the ones that I'm talking about, are called peekaboo eggs or panoramic eggs. I don't know that they're super ancient in origin, but we do see an interesting parallel in Mexico, of course, with the Day of the Dead, which is similar to Samhain, with the sugar skulls. And like this being an offering that you would put on an ofrenda, and like sugar being or sweets being specifically an offering. Of course, that's kind of I think sometimes associated more with chthonic deities, or like at least earthy. If you look at like traditions in Indonesia and in India, Ganesha's favorite offering is sweets, and so candy, I think, is often associated with fertility and excess in that kind of way. So it's interesting, candy being an offering for ancestors, because pretty universally, like offering for ancestors would be alcohol. That's like always appropriate, pour one out for the boys kind of thing. Or just like leaving a place setting during a holiday for like ancestors, or like giving them a portion. But yeah, I definitely think that my grandma was on some pagan shit when she was doing all of this wacky nonsense. Like we literally had like our mantle, like you would on Christmas, with the stockings and stuff, like just full of eggs. It's just like
so pagan.
some pagan.
Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned the sweets because we totally bypassed two topics on Baltic. One is amber, which is really important, um, and another one is honey. So I was telling you, I was looking into a few that we have these honey deities in here that we wanted to add for fun. Um, and I watched a video by, I'm forgetting the creator, but it was a pretty good video looking at a bunch of these honey goddesses and motifs around Europe, and they're true to Greece and Italy and Rome's as well as throughout the Middle East. There's like Hanhana, who's a very important bee goddess in Hittite even. So obviously beekeeping is something that would have been, I think it started in Anatolia sometime in the Neolithic. It was one of the very oldest domestications is the bee. Um, Obviously, because all you have to do is just kind of monitor and then try to maybe take some honey out of stuff, and then it evolves from there and you start to control it a little bit more. But honey has all of these, like the root of honey is like med and meth. I said meth, but it kind of has, there's methwy or whatever I think is Welsh. And then there's a version of that in
Melly.
Greek. What?
Yeah, melly. In
Yeah.
Latin, it would be melly. So to when something's melliferous or to ameliorate means to sweeten something.
Yeah. So context. This is true also, I think, when they give candy to hunter gatherers. Sometimes they offer candy to them as like, hey, try this. And it's so sweet that they almost like faint. And they're like, it's better than honey because that's the closest thing to something that sweet. And that's something we have to look at when it comes to like sugar cane. I think sugar cane was originally native to Indonesia, not actually the Americas this time. It was brought over to the Americas so that they can use slave labor to make it, and the environment was good enough, so not good. But sugar was not widespread at all in Europe. I think we looked at sugar beets was one that I think the Egyptians made in the Delta, and so sugar beets is one way in which they actually did have something quite sweet. Relatively, it has its own kind of rhubarb-like I think flavor to it or something. Rhubarb, nobody likes rhubarb. I think it's kind of fun, but it's definitely a weird sweet for sure.
And then, of course, here we have, maple syrup and all the
Yeah.
traditions to do with maple harvesting. And, the myth which talks about how, originally it was just syrup that came out of the trees, but because it was that Nanabozo that was so lazy, he was just laying around
Is it?
drinking syrup all day.
I didn't hear
So,
that one. That sounds great. Nanabozo would be a
yeah.
Ojibwe for everyone else. Ojibwe deity. He's like their trickster god. Um,
I'm pretty sure it's him, but I could be wrong.
It would make sense. I mean, there's got to be some maple syrup. I'm reminded of
Yeah.
this. I'm reminded of maybe it was one of the sons or daughters of Eagle. The elm tree was associated with honey at some point by the Balts because there's a sap that comes off of the elm tree, and it's considered. And that's interesting because amber is ancient fossilized sap from trees, and so both these topics that we didn't mention are actually kind of related because we have these sacred drinks, these sacred food of the gods that gives them their immortality. It's ambrosia and all these amber related motifs. Amrita, that's an example of a Vedic. It's the elixir of life, right? In a few of the myths I didn't mention, the palace the palace I mentioned with the Serpent King on the bottom of Baltic, sometimes, not always, that's called the Amber Palace because it was made of amber. There's another myth where there's a goddess that falls in love with a fisherman. They dance in there, and Perkunas, typically being mad and angered by everything, is like, that can't happen. We can't have mortals and gods together. So he sent a sea storm to go destroy the palace. And that's the explanation for why there's always amber washing up on the shores of the Baltic. Because amber is this ancient material that obviously we know of from probably most people from Jurassic Park. It's where they get their blood, even though that wouldn't have worked that way. But it's fossilized sea sap from ancient trees. And I'm a geologist, so I should probably know more details, but there's something about the region of the Baltic that had a whole lot of trees with sap, the pines and whatnot. I think that there was, I think in the sea there was like an ancient, a lot of, it had something to do with the glaciers constantly coming and going, is that there was regular growth and then deposition, and that goes back to the dinosaurs a long time ago too. Like it's just there's amber particularly a lot there, and the amber trade and the amber route went all the way through Bohemia down to Italy. They traded with the Etruscans and the Illyrians down to Greece and stuff, and this is a very important resource that Greeks imported in order to make things with, and it generally just became associated, like honey, with the divine liquid. I don't know if there is anything else to add about that. I guess in Baltic.
Just the color of mead, the color of amber, the color of the sun, like all that gold stuff.
Yeah, the sun. Yeah,
just all good.
Mm-hmm. And with the mead connection as well, because the video that I was watching was about honey and mead, in particular the alcoholic preparation or fermentation of honey. That's a sacred rite that was really important. It seems the Indo-Europeans, mead was their main drink, and it wasn't as beer as much because they weren't, settling down and making agriculture very much. Mead was this thing that they could kind of take with them, and it lasted very long, apparently. And the Celtic goddess that you're obviously most familiar in your practice, because mead is also one of your favorite drinks, right? Is Maeve, and she's the selective kind of queen of the gods, and her namesake is mead, and that has to do with that potentially that ancient Neolithic or other practice of alcoholic sort of basis of almost divination and partaking in the gods, like a very Dionysian. Dionysus, of course, has more to do with grapes and vineyards and wine, but.
Well, it also has to do with health, because prior to beer, watery beer being kind of the staple, is just a drink that was safe, that you didn't have to boil, because until like all the sanitation stuff was really on lockdown, the safest thing to do was just have alcohol, because then it would sterilize the water that it was put into, and mead in particular and honey in particular has other antiseptic and probiotic qualities. It has a lot of like health benefits, and like royal jelly has a lot of health benefits. So being in close proximity to bees also was thought to have just like the humming and just like their energy was actually thought to have, and is kind of being studied now for its potential calming, regulating health benefits, just because there's so many cool things that bees do in their crazy way of being and their communication, and like the way that they ventilate their hives, and that they're aware of all of their health problems, which is why it makes it particularly tragic that we're losing this fight so badly.
Bee population.
Nowadays, we're seeing bee die-offs in record numbers, and we just can't seem to get our shit together when it comes to preserving not only commercial honeybees, just for not starving to death and stuff, but all indigenous and domestic, like mason bees, non-hiving bees, individual bees. Everything is just kind of dying off in record rates. So we're a little bit screwed if we don't get our bee worship figured out. And we were joking a little bit about like Wicker Man and the pagan connection to bees and their kind of communal.
Not the bees.
Not the bees. Yeah. Well, just their way of being, their communal way of, their sacrificial way of being. And their hard work and all of those things being kind of close to the pagan ethos. But I guess to conclude, I'm gonna have to get going, but the final question I will leave with, and then you can continue to ask Josh stuff, as far as like a favorite, or like was there a deity that was interesting in particular to study? I would say for me, Regana was the most interesting, because it was a little hard to find the detail about like the epic battle, but I found that motif to be really interesting. The idea of having to drive back the sun. And it mentions in this book um, why that kind of has to do with like opposing the idea of cancerous growth, or like rather than, as Josh was saying, being this demonic malevolent thing, being this kind of regulatory thing that's like we need time to die down and rest and harvest and do all of these things. We can't just be relentlessly growing like a tumor. We have to have seasons, we have to have change, we have to keep things in check and have them in balance. So I was particularly taken by that theme and liked it. And I think Ragana was kind of an interesting and unique, because Baba Yaga is very much in like the main. It's just she's kind of out. We got video games about it. She's in lots of stuff. Um, but Ragana, kind of that younger form, or like more pictured, I think is still maybe an idea ahead of its time a little bit. It might take some time to take hold. But as far as like witchy goddesses, she's like way up there. She's got all the things as far as just being a witchy powerhouse, and I like all that.
Yeah,
And
Organa,
just
pretty cool.
the demon always lit.
Yeah, riding the crow. My favorite, I would say that probably, so there's a lot of deities that really interested me and I dive deeper into. So like Vevora I was very interested in always, and I dive deeper into her. Bang Putis, the Wind Father, is so interesting. There's so many connections to like Vedic and other things that I'm still trying to make sense of. Zemulux, like I said, probably my favorite in there because he's there's a reason I did the Voltuna video. It's like for some reason I'm resonating, or I really like this agricultural uh, king of the gods, god of the harvest. He's kind of obscure and not really appreciated in Indo-European mythologies, but is widespread nonetheless in all of their roots. I think he's really cool in his connection to those motifs, but also I really found myself really liking Divas as he's depicted in the stories about him in Baltic. Because often, in most cases, when I hear the Sky Father, like Oranos and whatnot, there's not really much about him. There's not much that he does. Like, Oranos does bad things. And so, Kronos has to go castrate him. So it's like, okay, not the best aspiration, not the best deity to necessarily heed or whatnot. And then, of course, in Christianity, there's the Sky Father is everything, right? And it gets annoying. But I really like how Divas in their depiction is this. I think the person in the book, writing the book, they saw what I saw too, is they saw like the wizard vagabond. They saw Gandalf, and they mentioned that in there. But he does actually take like a Gandalf form, and he just descends to the earth and he lives the life of humans, and very simple life. It's how Gandalf likes to play and hang out whenever like Gandalf is supposed to do his job and whatnot. He's kind of like, oh, do I have to? Can I just like smoke a pipe with the hobbits and blow fireworks and just read books? It's like, no, you got to do your job. And he's like, oh gosh, dang. I really like that part of Devas, how he's descending to the earth, being a humble, normal person, and every now and then just completely humbling some people who don't have their wires put straight, quite right, are immoral and not quite right, not hospitable, not compassionate. I like that because that could justify how he's away from everything. He's kind of like, oh, I'm so sick of this. Like, he's like Grandpa who's just like, oh, you guys are so bad. I'm sick of you. But every now and then he comes in there and is a nice guy. I felt like I got a lot out of that. It was very interesting.
We talked about, we've mentioned this a couple times, but to come back around, so like hospitality is like the cardinal sin. Like not providing hospitality is like in the northern reaches is like the cardinal sin, whereas like more towards the equator in the south, food is like not providing food, not providing copious amounts of food, right? If you have like a nice Italian grandmother, it's what do you need more pasta? We have a lot more pasta. You should probably have some more pasta.
Clean your plate or else.
Yeah, but in the north, it's like if you don't take someone in out of the cold, like that's the cardinal sin, for obvious reasons, kind of based on geography. But I've always thought that was kind of interesting, as far as like the social mores being shaped kind of by the environment in those ways. And the wandering, he's kind of like Jesus in some ways of like wandering and testing of like, you know, will you take him in? Do you know who that is? You have to be
Yeah.
hospitable to everyone on the off chance it could be,
Yeah,
you know.
I like that motif there of just like, hey, you got to be nice to everyone because it could be a Gad. He could be he could just be there and you're like, "Oh, geez, okay." It doesn't need that rationale in order to work, but it's certainly it's a fun story. And like how much of that cuz you could ask how much of that is Divas kind of having the characteristics of the morality of Jesus or the characteristics of the Christian God pushed on him. I suspect actually there's a lot more to this character that indicates it's not necessarily just an export because there really isn't like God doesn't do much, especially in the New Testament. He doesn't do anything at all. It's Jesus that does things and he just says things, So, and the teachings of Divos aren't necessarily Christian teachings at all. Like their hospitality is a very old motif that you see around the world with a lot of people, and yeah, across the north, and I think it's also a motif in the Americas. So it's it's not like some people might want to dismiss it, and that rightfully so, to say, oh, that's just God or whatever. I'm sick of him. It's like, well, but if we can integrate what that motif is supposed to be, I always like to think of the Christian God, at least the high up one, as being more like Oranos, more like this Aquarian provider god of the sky who's watching everyone and he wants the best for everyone and he's positive, but he doesn't necessarily get his hands dirty. Or he has all these other deities around him that have different roles to play. That's how I prefer to look at it. So for me, I'm kind of integrating Sky Father and trying to see what that actually really was originally. Because every indication is that hunter gatherers had a Sky Father and an Earth Mother. And that's way before any kind of Christianization and way before any kind of even Neolithic stuff, because that would be the Kronos and Rhea wave. But of course, those are all evolutions. They're all evolutions of kind of some of the same ancient motifs. So, with that, I suppose we might. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have something?
I gotta go, but you can
Yeah.
continue. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This was a fun experiment. I kind of like this format and doing a little bit of both. We'll go heavier on the Q&A next time.
Yeah.
Josh, did we have a topic selected for next week of which chart we're going to flesh out, or not so much?
No, we'll figure it out. It's always a surprise. Just like how last week, sometimes we just want to, it's like, sometimes we just want to hang out and talk about stuff, and yeah, please leave a like, anyone who's still here and enjoys this kind of thing. It really helps the algorithm, and people can maybe see this after it publishes as well. We're trying to be here every Sunday, but yeah, next week I feel like I might want to take a little break and just do some simple research. I don't know. Maybe we'll have a presentation, but we'll decide. We'll see what we want to do. It's up to both of us, not just me. So yeah, I'm actually going to sign off too. So why don't we just end it right here? Thanks for everyone joining. Leave a like, help us out. Thanks for all the comments. I loved answering these questions. And I'll see you guys next time. Signing off. Bye-bye.
On Wednesday. Yep. See you then.
Wednesday, yeah, on Wednesday we'll be in the server. I'll leave a link to the server down there so you can join it. Stick around. Don't run away. I'm going to leave a comment for the server for anyone who's interested. Okay. Yeah, so Wednesday, not streaming, just hanging out on the server, and then Sunday, streaming, doing something. So, yeah. See y'all. Bye. Oops.